Chapter 291, Chapter 17, Battle of Dawnstar Prelude. General POV about a day earlier. A group of some 10 gaunt figures dressed in plain black robes covered in nondescript light armor stood around in a circle, the haunting growls of the Draugr walking all around them, failing to disturb any of them. "Are the preparations finished?" the eldest among them asked a pair of youths that just entered the chamber. "They are, Jonas," the young man of the pair answered. "After the final count, we have some 700 or so Draugr, that is including the 300 or so servant bodies." Jonas scoffed. "We will have to bait them then." He turned to one of the other magi present. "What about the traps?" A woman in her late 20s shrugged. "Made as much as I could, even with the supplies he gave us, but they will slow them down at best." "Which is the entire point, woman." The man scoffs. "There is no way in hell we are stopping a whole army. We are here to buy time and die like the cannon fodder we are." Callan, the young man of the young pair, looked at him with a mix of fury and surprise. "Shut your hole, old man. We were given scrolls to make our retreat when this is over. If you want to die because you are paranoid, then go ahead." "Better to be paranoid than to trust that insane Mephilan fuck." Jonas grouses, and a couple of the other necromancers nod their agreement. Jenna, the young woman beside Cullen, scoffs and grabs her partner's shoulder. "Don't listen to them. We are getting out of here alive." The young man nodded slowly, almost hesitantly. "Aye, we've done enough by now. I think we've earned our lives at least." They both hoped it wasn't a mere platitude. Elsewhere, Galmar Stonefist marched before the vanguard of his king's army, his brow creased as he considered the thousands of men and women who had joined their force practically overnight. He did not doubt the fact they needed more bodies to throw at the enemy, but he was a great war veteran, and he knew deep down that conscripts made for very poor soldiers. At least he would be able to use them to buy the true warriors a chance for glory, he thought. "Stonefist, we have company," one of his men shouted, his hand pointing toward the entrance of an old Nordic tomb. A group of 36 Draugr handling old bows had rushed out when he wasn't looking and were preparing to loose arrows at his men. It took him a mere split second to react, and he was already charging at the ancient undead, his weapon swinging in a wide arc as he shattered the first embalmed creature to shreds. His men followed behind him and rushed to join the fight, but just as a couple more were cut down and they were about to engage them in truth, the Draugr retreated within the tomb. "Damnation!" one of the housecarls cursed. "They challenge us." Galmar did not see it that way, but it was better his men thought that to be the case instead of the obvious bait being laid out for them. Still, if he simply let the undead do what they willed, they would just keep attacking them at random, and that was unacceptable, both for their numbers and their morale. So, with a heavy heart, Stonefist grunted and signaled for a couple of his less valuable men to move in and scout. The moment they stepped within the bounds of the tomb, a rune below them lit up and burned them alive. This was going to be a long day, wasn't it? On the necromancer's side, the Stormcloaks wasted no time in assaulting their positions, and whoever was leading them knew what they were doing, as multiple traps were avoided and many ambushes foiled, leading to 3 necromancer conscripts dying already. "Damn it all," Jonas snarled and pointed at one of his fellows. "You, go and collapse the passages." Yes." The skittish man nodded and rushed off. That ought to slow them down at least. And it did. The Stormcloaks were forced down a pre-prepared path with dozens, and of them dying with each and every turn they made. And once their bodies fell, they soon rose to strike at their former comrades, further adding to the slaughter. Hours passed as more necromancers slowly fell to their assailants, and soon the main chamber was close to being breached, with only Jonas and the young pair still remained among the living, and their undead were being depleted at a rapid pace. Sighing in acceptance, Jonas turned to the duo. "We've held for as long as we could. You two should get out of here now." Callan blinked. But what about you?" "What about me?" Jonas scoffed. "I fully accept and understand why I am here, and I know I deserve it. Fucking Flametongue was right in that, at the very least." He shakes his head. "You two, on the other hand, are young and should look to live your lives a bit before throwing them away." The duo shared a look before nodding resolutely and opening a pair of scrolls, soon disappearing with the sound of cracking glass. Jonas chuckled. Would you look at that? The fucker wasn't lying. He looked back to the doorway as it was slowly torn apart, and with an air of resignation started chugging potion after potion, once more courtesy of their employer. Power like he had not felt in his life flowed in his veins even as he poisoned himself to a slow death, and he started cackling like a complete madman. Corpses which were previously in too poor a shape to be risen slowly stood up, and the entire tomb came to life as howls of undead rage were met with the hatred-filled battle cries of the Stormcloaks. By the time his sanctum was breached, Jonas was not coherent enough to notice the axe sailing for his head, nor the snarling, bare-hooded man that swung it. Galmar's POV. I spit on the insane fuck that had just cost me hundreds of my men, my troops slowly flowing in behind me as they made sure the undead could not rise again. I was just about to relax when a messenger boy rushed inside and called out, "Lord Galmar, terrible news." "What is it, whelp?" I rounded on him. "Our supply train was just ambushed. Undead, they say, and lots of them." The boy answered quickly. They managed to slay them, but the battle caused a small avalanche and blocked off the rest of our troops. I closed my eyes, contemplated the fact that a bunch of rogue necromancers just cost us days of time, and finally swore, "Fuck." Remaining necromancers POV. Callan and Jenna appeared within the Imperial encampment in a flash of colour, both of them too worn out to even care about the vertigo caused by such a sudden shift. In fact, they would have probably let themselves sleep then, and there had it not been for the sound of someone clearing their throat. Both of them immediately turned rigid as they stood up and saluted the elf that waited for them. They dared not speak and were thankfully spared of any further awkwardness as Raven Flametongue spoke first. "Are you all that is left?" he asked, almost uninterested. "Yes," Callan nodded. Yes, sir," he quickly added. The elf shook his head. "Pity, I had expected more of you to have instincts of self-preservation." He waves his hand, and two folded scrolls appear within his grip. "No matter, take these and present them at the College of Winterhold. Your conscription is over, and by the authority the High King vested in me, you are hereby pardoned for your crimes." Both of them stared at the elf, their mouths agape. They would have probably remained staring for a great while longer, but the repeated waving of the court mage's hand quickly told them of his annoyance as they grabbed the scrolls and bowed to show their gratitude. By the time they rose their heads, they realized they were completely alone in the tent. Back to the present, Raven's POV. I pondered the reports coming in before swiftly getting bored and speaking up. "Why don't we go and see what the rebels want?" They seem to be quite eager to talk. As soon as the words leave my mouth, Tullius promptly tries to ruin my fun. Why would we waste time speaking to the rebels? I'd say that their intentions are clear as day even from here. General. I looked down at him chidingly. You can't forgo the time-honored tradition of pre-battle shit-talking. That is just not done. The fact that some of his Nordic officers nod along with my words as if they were gospel of the divine itself does not go over the old general's head as he glares at us, equally at first, but soon focusing fully on his own men, as at least that had some minor effect. "Look," I point to the other end of the field excitedly, "it seems even the rebels agree." Tullius slowly palms his face and sighs, "Fine." "Yes!" I clutch my fist triumphantly. It did not take long before messages were exchanged between both sides and a short parley was agreed upon. We all knew nothing would come of it, but there was always a chance of gaining some information through these pre-battle meetups, so we still packed up and met Ulfric and his group atop a very small hill exactly between our forces. Both parties brought 10 guards with them and were made up of 3 leaders. Tullius, Ricker, and myself representing the Empire Oi, and our opponents were represented by Ulfric himself, Galmar Stonefist, and a rather crispy-looking Grimnir Shattershield. Well done indeed. "What is this Shattershield?" I ask before anyone has the time to speak. "Have you no healers over in Windhelm?" The burned man glares at me with such hatred I would think he was trying to share his affliction, but Ulfric stops him before he can offer a retort. "Don't let him provoke you." I hear him mutter, "You said you were ready." The old man seems to war with himself briefly, but deflates after a while. "Very well." Scorch whistles. Damn, even his voice sounds crispy. Tullius observed the little exchange with a glint in his eyes that was not there before, and just as I finished goading our enemies, it seemed as if he made some kind of decision, his back straightening, and even while he was shorter than the man, he seemed to look down on the rebel leader, his tone sounding dismissive as he spoke. "Why have you requested to talk, Ulfric?" The rightful High King, as he liked to be called, was unmoved by the lack of title, but this was not shared with his subordinates, as Galmar almost growled in response to the Imperial's choice of words. "If you must continue to dispute Lord Ulfric's kingship, then you will refer to him by his title as Jarl." The air seems to shift around him as the general chuckles at the response, a grin of such self-satisfaction soon spreading on his face that I thought the man possessed for a brief moment. "Funny you should mention that." He muses and proffers his hand to his second-in-command, Rika. She nods and quickly pulls out a folded scroll with Emperor Titus' own seal upon it. The general unrolls it and clears his throat. As of the 20th of First Seed, in the 200th year of the Fourth Era, due to their unlawful and violent attempt to attain a higher position of power, and their inability to control their forces, and the suffering caused by such a lack of ability, the Stormcloak clan is hereby stripped of all noble rights and privileges, the city of Windhelm included within those same rights. Signed, Emperor Titus Mede II of Tamriel and High King Torrig of Skyrim. The entire hill turns completely silent. Well, silent save for my quiet, childish giggling, to think Titus managed to do this without me knowing. Rarely did I find myself genuinely impressed by someone, and this was one of those times. While both of his aides were close to frothing at the mouth, Ulfric remained outwardly composed and coldly retorted, "The decisions of a fallen empire and a false high king are not something that either my people or I recognize." Oh, he may have looked composed, but the burning fury I could feel coming from within the depths of his soul far outstripped that of Shattershield's anger at the damage I inflicted upon his crusty ass. Your willful stubbornness surprises no one. The general practically ignores him. "Now, Ulfric," he repeats, pointedly glaring at the once veteran legionary that was Galmar, "why have you called for this parley?" The false king's eyes fall upon the distant field briefly before he speaks. "I have come to tell you to leave. We both have the dragons to contend with now, and getting your men killed here will leave the other holds open to attack." His back straightened. "So I say go. Leave us to protect our kin against this new threat." An obvious attempt to buy time to recover his forces and fortify, but I would have none of that pathetic. I spit out with more vitriol than I thought myself feeling. "To think that you, the man who inadvertently caused their presence in the first place, would try and use the dragons for your own ends." I spit on the ground between our two groups. "For all your bravado and false confidence, you have come here to see your men dead, and this little revolt finally over. So shut up and wait for death like the good little Thalmor puppet you are." I do not wait for their response as I turn to leave, pointedly dragging the Legion officers with me and not letting them look back as we were swiftly surrounded by our guards and descended the hill. The Stormcloaks glared at our backs the entire time as we descended, and for a giddy moment I almost hoped Ulfric would try and use the Thuum in some petty attempt at revenge. But his window of opportunity soon passed, and they too were forced to return to their army. The little fact that his officers were questioning him on the exact meaning of my words as they did so was just a nice little bonus. I have to say that went far better than I expected. Tullius hums in satisfaction. Rika gives him a dumbfounded look. All we did was go up there and throw insults at them without even letting them talk. "Exactly," I nod happily. "That was the entire point, Legate." Tullius smiles. "We agitated the enemy leadership without suffering no such fate ourselves." So much for shit talk being a waste of time. I huff. The general gives me a sour look. "Just let me have this." A mere hour passed before the Stormcloaks started sending out their vanguard skirmishers from their own fortified campsite, positioned snugly at the exit of the pass they used to get here. Their walls were not as uniform and well made as the Imperials, but they still managed to create an imposing defensive position with a combination of grit, stubbornness, and lots of pounded dirt. This also made our own artillery mostly ineffectual, as even with Cyrodiilic expertise, the target was just too far to do reliable damage and the munitions too expensive for us to waste willy-nilly. Much like ourselves, they too did not forego the advantage that artillery would bring, and so they sent a good number of their men to a nearby patch of forest so they could construct it in camp. From what I could glean, they only brought the munitions and metal bits, as trudging through mountain passes with heavy artillery was at best a death sentence only for the artillery and a good chunk of the army itself at worst. Sadly, it would seem that whatever magi they brought beside the old Shattershield were paying attention because Scorch failed to commit his usual war crimes even once. Back to the enemy vanguard, they did not descend upon us in their full number, not even close. Groups of around 120 men begun their attacks at our forward position, exchanging thrown weapons and even engaging in a brief melee before retreating back to their camp, no doubt to share information with their leaders. Not all of us were blessed with bullshit magic eyes after all. The newfound back and forth continued for the entire day, with no great amount of territory changing hands, even as hundreds died on both sides by the end of it. I will give the Stormcloaks this: fuckers were relentless. How they managed to get even casualties with our forward positions while having worse equipment and being on the attack, I honestly did not want to know, but they sure as shit did. Their engineers must have been working fast because as soon as the mists dispersed the next day, our forward camps, the minor fortified positions connected by a simple stake palisade, saw themselves showered in pots of explosive oil. It did not do much damage as I personally blew any truly dangerous shells out of the air, but the constant bombardment did a number on the legionaries' morale, and the follow-up attacks started stacking up kills for the Stormcloak side. I was just about to ascend into the skies and show them just what I thought about them daring to use strategy against us, but Tullius proposed that that was exactly what they wanted, a likely attempt of trapping or distracting me, and I was forced to remain grounded as I agreed with his assessment. And so the preamble went on for 2 more whole days, accompanied with more forgotten dreams, much to my irritation. On the dawn of the 5th day of the siege, the Stormcloak camp seemed to surge almost as if it were a nest of ants. It did not take much for me to put 2 and 2 together and realize their reinforcements were finally set up enough for the army to act in cohesion, and it was time for them to attack us in truth. Thousands of men and women in lighter armor marched into the forests to the east, while a veritable army of well over 15,000 started slowly approaching the front line, the constant explosions caused by the artillery of both sides being the only thing breaking the ground-shaking noise of their steps. More worrying was the fact that the enemy center was made up almost entirely of heavily armored housecarls, all of them surrounding Ulfric and Grimnir, and what I vaguely recognized as men wearing the same uniform as those beginner tongues I decimated near Helgen. Almost leisurely, I got up and stretched, Orin's eyes immediately snapping to me as I did so. I pat the man lazily on his pauldron. No need to follow me this time, just do as much damage as you can and keep the casualties to a minimum. The captain of my forces salutes, but hesitates. What? What if the Imperials question our reluctance to fight? I roll my eyes, then they will have to find someone else to heal their ungrateful asses after the fighting is done. He takes no further prompting and accepts his orders. I spent a while longer looking over the approaching army, 4 forward camps having already been given the order to retreat after they did sufficient damage to the enemy, and just as I was about to go and find him, it would seem that Tullius decided to do present himself instead. That is at least 5,000 more than expected, not counting the potentially equal number still in camp. I tell him without turning around. Yes. The general grinds out, I had hoped that your mysterious informant was incompetent, but I've learned not to rely on such hopes as of recently. To think Ulfric would be willing to go so far just to win this one battle. And should he win it, truly would only be this one battle. Forcing so many to fight may seem simple on paper, but Ulfric had just created the next generation of Skyrim's banditry with this one retarded move. Did you need something, General? I ask, my eyes still focused on the enemy. He pauses briefly. I suspect Ulfric may attempt to abuse the voice to punch through our lines. And you want me to counter him? I ask, and he tenses up. I already planned on doing so. That seems to relax the general greatly. Good, I will ensure you do not find yourself without a way to retreat should their numbers overpower you, however briefly. Now you are talking my language. I grin and finally turn to the man. Good luck, General. And you, Court Mage. He offers his hand and we share a warrior's handshake. An instant passes and I am already flying up into the air, Scorch's wings blazing brightly and drawing thousands of eyes upwards. General POV. Ulfric Stormcloak stepped in front of his sworn companions, his heart alight with righteous fury as he glared at the wooden fort blocking his way to his people in Dawnstar. Without any hesitation or care for the lives within, he breathed deeply of Kyne's breath. Fuse Rodar! The mighty call of unrelenting force surged toward the pitiful gates, only to suddenly disperse as the very earth rose in such massive volume as to dispel the shout fully. The risen earth was then split aside, leaving the sight of a singular figure clad in black and purple standing before his entire army. Tell the others to commence the attack. Ulfric commanded one of his aides. We will deal with the elf. His men did as commanded, and he centered himself, ready to face the true monster of the enemy. Even as he prepared to charge his hated foe, Ulfric could not help but suppress a tiny little shudder. Why exactly was the damned creature looking at him with such hunger? Chapter 292, Chapter Distit, Battle of Dawnstar First Clash. Raven's POV. The cacophony of battle surrounded me on all sides, but seemed to recede the closer to me and my challenges it got, almost forming a bubble of relative silence as Ulfric and his most powerful warriors glared daggers at me. A good morning to you all. I bow grandly, my hands empty of weapons for the moment. I'd bring out some mead, but I am afraid the weather is a tad too tumultuous for such. Grimnir Shattershield grips his hammer so hard I see his hands go white under his gauntlets. I have been waiting for this. He half rasps, half growls. Waiting for what? I tilt my head, ignoring the pot exploding to my side, getting your other side burned off. You murdered all my apprentices, you bastard, he growls, the hammer crackling with enchanted lightning. Kinda respectable now that I look at it. Scorch ponders the runes as if dozens of men were not dying around us by the second. And you brought them with you. I retort easily, is it not the responsibility of the master to protect the student and not expose them to grave danger? Would that not mean it was you and not me who killed them? Whatever he wanted to say next gets stuck in his throat as he simply shuts his mouth and settles on trying to glare holes in me. And what of you, Ulfric? I turn to the main shit-stirrer himself. You have been awfully silent since your little greeting. For what reason do you prattle on? He growls, his face hidden behind the same helmet he wore when he faced Torrig on that fateful day. Oh, you know. I shrug, just wasting time, greeting opponents. My eyes blaze with cruelty, casting spells. In an instant, the very skies turn ablaze as I swiftly cast a fire-resistant spell on myself, and the entire field around me is covered by a pillar of flames. Even as everything burns and those enemies competent enough to erect wards do so, I do not waste time. Blasphemy appears in my hand, and wasting no time, I rush through the wall of gold without any fear and start cutting down those who may have survived. Dozens of heads hit the burned dirt before I am forced to suddenly shout, "Fame!" as another blast of unrelenting force rushes all around me, turning the bodies those same heads belong to into fine paste and dispelling my firestorm. The Stormcloak contingent, now a good 60 men weaker, turn silent as the grave as their sight clears, before many of them are assaulted by a sense of despair, fueled both by my power and crown and by the mere sight of me. There I was, standing with not a hair out of place, surrounded by blood dirt and gore. I was about to start gloating again. Maybe they would fall for it once more, I thought, but then I felt the most surprising of feelings, a sense of danger. I couldn't help but grin as I was forced to tilt my head out of the way of a particularly potent spear of ice that promptly sheared the small patch of dirt behind me to shreds. It did not take me long to realize the origin of such a spell as I looked at the enemy ranks. Dozens of high-adept magi were all overcharging spells and placing them under Shattershield's direction. All of them had bandoliers full of magicka potions hanging off them and were more than willing to overdose on them if it meant killing me today. And as if that was not enough, the dozen singed men now surrounding Ulfric felt like they too carried Kind's blessing. I guess I have to put some respect on them now, don't I? I go to shadow step right into their ranks, but find the space around us solid as rock. Grimnir must have been waiting for this moment as he grinned at my empty step. Likely expecting some kind of surprised reaction, he did not like what he got instead. Now that is what I am fucking talking about, I exclaim happily and summon the ebony blade in my free hand before aiming myself straight at Ulfric Wold. General POV. Within the eastern forest of Dawnstar, a thin dirt path crossed a small creek that cut through the thick woods widely enough to provide something of a natural barrier. Hundreds of men, most of whom wore Morthal livery, and the rest that of Solitude and Winterhold, hid within the large trees to the creek's north and made as little noise as possible. Upon a small rise, two young men in higher quality armor were kneeling and doing their best to glean the distant canopy for any movement. "Hate the waiting," muttered the one in Winterhold colors. I have to agree. His imperial compatriot nodded easily, one moment of not paying attention, and he snapped his fingers. "Poof, you are dead." "Exactly," Thorfinn agrees. "Say, has your monstrosity of a cat noticed anything yet?" Tiberius went to retort his choice of words, but thought better of it. "Nothing quite yet." He shook his head. "I know we are more useful here, but I still wish we could have gotten our glory out in the open." "Bah!" The Winterhold Thane scoffs. "We will get plenty of glory no matter where we fight, so long as we fight. Don't tell me you feel jealous of Raven already?" This time it was Tiberius's turn to scoff. "I am nowhere near so foolish as to even dream of it. Where that madman draws all his power from, I will never under—" His words die in his throat as a distant flash of gold briefly sets the skies on fire. "Well, I guess we know for sure the battle has started now," Tiberius says with a nervous chuckle. "Quiet, you two." A tall orc barks at them as he moves up to their position as silently as possible. "Eyes up front and keep your mouths shut. If the fighting has already started, then they have entered the woods even earlier." It did not take long for Zarok's words to be proven true as Tiberius's familiar dispelled not long after, and the entire force was placed under high alert. Mere minutes later, they could hear the sound of marching boots, and then they could see them, hundreds upon hundreds of rebels, all of them moving through the woods with familiar surety and with what many would call unearned confidence. Whoever was leading the rebels was no great general, however, as the Stormcloak forces did not even pause to pay attention to the creek and the incline it created. The ambushing Imperials waited until a good 300 of them had crossed, not a one of them making a single sound as their hated enemy passed them by, and then at Zarok's nod, Tiberius focused his magic below their ranks. The rebels barely had the time to react to the purple runes before an entire unit of Dremora appeared within their ranks and started butchering them. The sudden attack being all the signal the legionaries needed as their javelins were soon followed by their blades and shields. The rebels' flanking attack swiftly turned into a charnel house as the battle line soon descended into a bloody free-for-all. As for the Stormcloak commander, his body was the first to fall. Thorfinn's knife sunk deeply into the side of his neck. The young Nord did not even glance at the gurgling Riften Thane and simply flicked his knife back before descending down upon the rest of his subordinates, his entire body tingling with alteration magic. The forest was filled with screams, curses, and the sound of battle for what must have felt like hours, but was in all likelihood mere minutes before all sound disappeared and a deathly silence descended. With mechanical efficiency, the Imperials picked up their wounded and retreated to their next ambush point, leaving the forest creek in complete silence, the once transparent waters now flowing red. Tullius's POV. "We are holding well enough for now, but they are using their weight to force openings in our lines, and then flooding them with bodies if they have to." I ponder the developing battlefield while absently giving out orders for certain cohorts to move into the reinforcement range of those already engaged in the fighting. I am going to need to wait for an opportunity to present itself. Ricker is holding the west perfectly, but has no good offensive troops, and the east already has us at a number disadvantage. "Marneus," I call out. The legate of my personal guard salutes. "Sir." I want the western center to start letting some of the rebels through. Once they start swarming, I want you to draw them in before having the Bretons crush through their formation. I dictate the order while using figurines to give him an idea of what specific units to use in the maneuver. Should you fail, I want them showered in arrows and artillery until the line is stabilized. With all due respect, General, isn't this too risky? He asks. It is, I admit begrudgingly, but we cannot permit the battle to turn into one of attrition. Even if we were to win, the costs would be disastrous. Who dares wins, eh, sir? The veteran legate smirks. Quite. I nod in turn, and we share a salute before he steps out. Report, I call out the moment the messenger steps into the command post. General, sir. He salutes, both his voice and posture holding a fair bit of panic. Report from the siege camps, General. The Dawnstar garrison is sallying out on the eastern fort. Shit. Just what I needed right now. I curse internally, but do not let it show. The forts should hold, soldier. I want reports from that clash every 20 minutes. Should the enemy manage a push, inform me immediately. The Markarth infantry should be more than enough to deflect any attack, even while outnumbered. At once, General. The messenger salutes and rushes out. As more and more reports on the battle came in, I could not help but hum internally. How wrong was it that I enjoyed the utter chaos of commanding a battle? Raven's POV. I duck below a Dane axe, one of my shades jumping out from behind me and impaling the offending stormcloak through the throat with its blade. Not stopping for even a moment, I jump out of the way and find myself to the side of a surprised mage. He attempts to step back, but I have already grasped his head and moved him into the way of Ulfric's axes, the weapons enhanced by the elemental fury shout cleaving through the young man without a hint of resistance. The rebel leader snarls in rage as he is forced to block a flurry of counterattacks from both myself and those shades I could free up from keeping his other men at bay. Grimnir, who was attempting to smash the back of my head, is forced to step back as I slow time and summon my glaive, almost impaling him in one movement. He still lost his remaining ear for the trouble, though. Scorch claws out the throat of a nearby mage who was attempting to heal his teacher and is promptly blown away by another one who now lacked an eye. As blades and spells flash all around me, I allow myself to sink deeper and deeper into the zone. I duck under another of Ulfric's swings and deliver a jab with my dagger through a small gap in his armor. Pulling back swiftly and avoiding another swing of Shattershield's hammer, I pivot into another Housecarl's path and shove him onto one of his friends. Before they can reorient, I rush away and toward the mage. The one-eyed mage only has the time to slightly piss himself before I twist myself around him and promptly rip out his spine with my clawed gauntlet. The very important group of bones soon found themselves in the face of a rather surprised Grimnir, as I used his stunned state to deliver a fully powered punch, crushing straight through the excavated bone and crumbling a good chunk of the man's face, including his nose. I step back from another swing of a duo of Orichalcum war axes and unsummon my weapons as I find myself fully surrounded by another group of housecarls. Neither of us was dumb enough to think that fact was to their advantage. My hands blazed with fire as I blasted everything around me with crimson flames, weapons, armors, flesh. It did not matter to the ravenous magic as it consumed everything it touched, only those with enchanted equipment or those lucky enough to be protected by the trio of still-living magi surviving the blast. He must be getting tired, Ulfric exclaims, with me sons and daughters of Skyrim. The mental image of my spiders finding the underground ward, currently hindering my teleportation and promptly consuming an integral part of it, enters my mind as I let out a cold chuckle and immediately teleport myself away from their group. I lazily flick a cigar in my mouth as they realize their little attempt was thoroughly foiled. Tired, Ulfric? I ask mockingly. I am just getting started. Chapter 293, Chapter 19, Battle of Dawnstar, The Rout. The battlefield around us seemed to quieten once more as I rested a foot on a mangled corpse to my side, while giving the remaining elites of the enemy a mocking smirk they could more feel than see at this distance. Now that we were not attempting to rend each other into tiny bits, Ulfric finally got a good look around him and the dozens upon dozens of corpses of his shield brothers, all of them looking like they belonged at a butcher's shop and not a battlefield. His eyes found mine once again, a cigar lazily held between my fingers as I leaned on my glaive without a single spot out of place. It could in fact be said that I looked cleaner than many a thane stationed in the Blue Palace. And it was that sight that confirmed his decision as he gave me one final glare before ordering in a voice more bitter than even I, in all my low opinion of the man, had expected, "We retreat." He grit out. His words seemed to almost drain all the fighting spirit left within his men, but he should have expected as much. He, a Nord king by his own words, was turning tail and running from an elf. Before any of them can react to the command, I lazily raise my hand as if to stop them, my magicka already bubbling back to the surface in preparation for a lunge, making them all tense up and focus back on me. "And what exactly gave you the impression any of you were going to be leaving this field alive?" I ask in a falsely polite tone. Fear enters the less powerful among them, even as they attempt to hide it from their brothers in arms. But the leaders seem to have a completely different reaction as Grimnir gives Ulfric a solemn look, and a nod is shared. "I will see you in the halls of our ancestors, brother." Ulfric offers to shake his hand, but the old man simply smiles and proceeds to kick him away. Just in time for my blurry form to pass them both and stop only as I impale one of their unsuspecting magi on my glaive, setting him on fire in the process and tossing his burning carcass at a nearby man who was trying to bring a horse to his retreating lord. I blink away from my position and appear at Ulfric's side, my weapon already in full swing, but I have to pull back at the last moment as Grimnir also uses teleportation and attempts to smash my hand with his hammer. By the time I could look back, Ulfric had already used Whirlwind Sprint and was halfway across the battlefield, his elites retreating after him at much lesser speeds, all of them leaving their best mage to his fate. "Yeah, as if." I scoff, and as Grimnir goes in for an attack and spell combo, attempting to hold me in place and smash me at the same time, I use the small window of time before the spell lands to yank a nearby shadow and appear just behind a breathless novice tongue. Suffice it to say, he would remain breathless for an eternity, as I promptly removed his head with a rapid swing. Things devolved into a deranged version of a game of cat and mouse, as Grimnir attempted to chase me down and stop me from teleporting around, while I proceeded to murder as many of Ulfric's prized warriors as I could before the old man finally did. Finally, after 20 dead men, one of the idiots got their head out of their arse and actually tried fighting back with his greater-than-average strength, and he bought enough time for the old man to catch up and cast a temporary spatial lock from a very expensive-looking scroll. I pulled the ebony blade out of the eye socket of the brave Stormcloak, the man dead before his body hit the ground, and turned back to shatter shield. "Bought that just for little old me, have you?" "Shut your cursed mouth, you monster." He grits his teeth, his eyes almost alight with the hatred he held for me. "What is it, you old fart? Upset I did not play along with your little heroic sacrifice bit?" I ask in a mocking drawl as I lightly swing the piercing ebony dagger and let the blood fly off its surface. "Silence, you honorless cur." Whatever little composure must have been completely broken by my utter lack of care for his men. "Just shut up and face me." "Oh, don't you worry." I drawl on, "I had every intention of making this place your grave." I point to a hole which wasn't there a moment ago. "Look, I even dug it in advance." He doesn't answer, save for an enraged battle cry and a wall of frost and lightning slamming into my previous position. I pivot on one foot just as I land from my sudden jump, and with a flick of my hand, blast the rushing old man with a massively overcharged fireball, completely ruining his shield hand and launching him bodily against a nearby tree. Grimnir barely had the time to raise his hammer and prop himself up against the now felled bit of forest before I appeared in front of him once more, blasphemy raised high and ready to remove everything in its path. He only barely managed to stop my overhead swing, the deadly blade held back just an inch away from his forehead as he struggled heroically against my attack. His eyes focused fully on my weapon as he had seen what it could do with a mere touch. And that focus cost him his life. Without the barest hint of any respect or mercy, I kicked him in the chest, and with a pained grunt, his guard faltered, letting my blade descend further and turn his wizened face into so many fine chunks of shattered meat as the Vorpal curse went to work. With that bit of work done, I shunted the now headless corpse into the grave I made and turned to the rest of the battlefield. The scene that greeted me was encouraging as I saw the enemy morale faltering, especially those who were close enough to me to see the events that occurred in front of the legionary fort's gates, as they all looked just about ready to contemplate a full rout. My own people held their own pretty well, and I mentally kicked Oren up a notch in the usefulness department as I saw him deliberately having my marksmen target enemy officers, and what little tongues Ulfric decided to disperse among his less important units. Filling them with so many bolts, poor fuckers were probably more steel than flesh at that point. Nords were brave, but seeing one of their heroes fall after their king was forced to retreat would break even their spirits. And so naturally, I decided to abuse that fact. I cleared my throat, already enhancing my voice to make it carry for kilometers, to all rebel idiots still thinking they can pull out a victory. I held back a wince as I almost deafened myself, but still managed to soldier on. Your leader has fled before me, and his mage lies slain at my feet. Kindly stop wasting my time further and surrender. And just if the lazy, self-assured drawl I just delivered wasn't enough, the moment I finished speaking, the only breach in our lines that looked so obviously engineered it was insulting, even as thousands of the Stormcloak rebels poured within, was filled with the sound of pained screams and galloping hooves. The battle cries invoking the names of high rock cities and some of the more obscure Breton deities coming from that direction left little doubt as to what was happening. The full knightly contingent of our army broke through those lines, completely shattering any cohesion the rebels may have still held with their heavily armored horses and lances that failed to break even after slaughtering 5 Stormcloaks apiece. Behind the knightly chargers rode the horsemen of Whiterun, reminding me a bunch of Rohirrim as they rode down anyone lucky enough to survive the Bretons' wrath, gleefully cutting through the enemy flanks as they emerged onto the main battle line. Some of the more well-armed and armored rebel groups attempted to form a rearguard to hold back the tide of flagging morale, but I had grown tired of their stubbornness and ascended into the skies once more, doing my best impression of a carpet bomber as I showered them in fire and lightning. Needless to say, the Stormcloaks' morale was well and truly crushed at this point, and hundreds, maybe even thousands more of them died before they could reach the relative safety of their camp, and hundreds more would succumb to their wounds before the night was through. Truly a productive day, I think, with a satisfied smile and pointedly ignore the small tiny part of me telling me that thousands of men dying in a bloody melee in the span of mere hours was in fact supposed to be a bad thing. The mostly Nordic force of the Legion of Skyrim gave me a wide berth as I walked through the main camp of our forces, a mix of awe and respectful dread obvious in their eyes as they watched my passing. Oh, they had heard tales of my exploits, a good number of them even participating in the pacification of the Reachmen years ago, but none save for those who participated in the assault on Volkihar, or those who were stationed at Helgen recently knew just how far my powers had risen. Ulfric was himself something of a legend among the Nords, even with his obvious use of Nordic tradition. Only when it suited him, he was still respected as the man who would stand up against the elves and push them out of Skyrim with an honorable Nord warrior's hand. That had been shattered most thoroughly today. Any sympathy the legionaries from the loyal holds may have held for the man was lost when he abandoned his men to die and fled before an elf who had done more for Skyrim than his hairy ass ever would. Tullius's guardsmen saluted me crisply as I entered the command tent. The place was even more swamped than usual, with messengers running in and out as they delivered the battle reports from their positions. Everything was taken into account by the veteran command staff and their newly raised apprentices. The amount of shields broken, the unrecoverable javelins, the artillery ammunition spent, and 1,000 other details that may seem inane at first glance, but swiftly formed a neat picture of the battle's expenses and would allow our logistics to flow without any interruption or mistake. General, I greeted, and to their credit, all officers save the old Imperial remained fixated on their tasks as he looked up at me. Court Mage. He greets with a court nod, even as his eyes glint with appreciation. If my reports are to be believed, your actions alone have saved thousands of my men today. He informs me, you have my thanks. I offer a satisfied smirk in turn. It was my genuine pleasure. My tone this time was more than enough to make some of the less experienced officers gape for a moment before they thought better of it and got back to work. "How are the casualties?" I ask as I take a seat. Tullius's eye twitches in irritation. "Our center has approximately 3,000 fallen, while the enemy has 7. Almost half of those losses happened in the rout caused by you and our Breton allies." He sighs. "There was also an attack from the city itself, aimed toward the eastern fort, but it was held back, if just barely." "You think they will sally out again?" I ask immediately. He nods grimly. "Yes, we will have to station even more men to garrison those positions." "Right." I agree, sharing some of his consternation. As much as I would like to have all of this over and done with, I do not believe for a second we have broken the rebels' spirits with only today. "Quite." The general confirms, "Rarely is a battle over after only one clash, especially one this intense." I nod along. "And what of our other flanks?" Riker has held her position with relatively light losses against Galmar's Stonefist's assault, but has not done much damage in turn either. The two seem to be perfectly content in bashing their shield walls against each other, and I am more than happy to let them continue. He lists off while glancing at a nearby report. Fresh reports have yet to arrive from the forest, but the most recent one implies a costly victory for our side. Almost as if summoned by Tullius's words, a man in Morthal livery rushed into the tent and almost fell on his face as he forced himself to stop running. He looked around in a panic before his eyes landed on me. "Sir, Battle Mage Tiberius took a javelin to the thigh. We are unsure if he will survive without immediate aid." The entire tent turned silent, as many of the officers grew rather worried about the cheerful young man, but Tullius and I could only share looks of disappointment. After slowly palming my face, I got up from my seat and spoke. "General, permission to put your battle mage through a training regime from oblivion itself?" I ask with false cheer. The satisfied grin the man's face twisted into sent shivers down the spines of his subordinates as he nodded. "Granted." Chapter 294. Chapter 10. Battle of Dawnstar, a slaughter. 2 more days had passed since the initial big clash of our armies, with neither side gaining all that much ground from the other. The Stormcloaks were still resting, and Ulfric was likely scrambling to repair his side's still flagging morale, while Tullius felt that taking any ground we did not hold in the first place was tactically unsound and, quite frankly, a waste of lives. We were the defenders here, and attacking an enemy when time was not in their favor was just plain idiotic. That is not to say there was no fighting happening all over the place. Both sides kept engaging in minor skirmishes, with the only real major fighting happening around the forest and the eastern fort guarding the besieged city. Hundreds of men and women still died as each day passed, but this naturally failed to come even close to the utter bloodbath the mere 3 hours of battle had brought days earlier. The Dawnstar garrison was almost relentless in their attempts to break out, but sadly, whoever was commanding them now was unfortunately intelligent enough to leave all of his flanks fully staffed, else we would have just stormed one of the flanks once they attempted another breakout and taken the city with barely any resistance. Another batch of reinforcements, mostly made up of old veterans from what I managed to spy, had arrived in the Stormcloak camp overnight, but the news of Ulfric's shameful retreat had already spread throughout the ranks, taking the wind out of the sails of Ulfric's downright hysteric attempts to motivate his people for another clash. And so I found myself sitting in the middle of a neat forest clearing, pondering my orb while a miserable sod barely held himself back from begging for mercy as crossbows discharged all around him, knowing damn well it would only earn him more torment. "Big D, anything new happening over in the college?" "Busy burning rebels ATM, so can't really come personally." "Savos, the new batch of students seems promising, and the previous year's generation has almost universally cleared their adept exams, so nothing unusual if I am being honest. Also, must you word it that way?" Lizard Wizard, "If they didn't want to burn, why so flammable?" Savos, "Of course, how foolish of me." Sugar from Heaven, "How does this thing work? Is it on?" Big D, "You already made it work, Hakan. Just think what you want written, and the orb will interpret the rest." Sugar from Heaven, "Ah, most excellent. I thought you might want to know that we got a message over from Morthal asking for a new court wizard. My apprentice decided to accept it provisionally. Big D, while I am impressed Idgrod decided to stop being a fucking idiot about running her hold, I am genuinely surprised Morrigan went for it. What with her whole obsession with wealth and luxury, that place is a shithole. Sugar from heaven. Well, she was finally finishing her apprenticeship anyway, and the bogs are a good place to source ingredients, so it isn't that bad of a decision. Big D, quite, especially if she invests in proper magically enhanced housing. Skeletor, there are other forms of housing. Also, why does my name keep changing to this? It isn't even spelled out correctly. Big D, your lack of enlightenment disappoints me, Phineas. Skeletor, ah yes, the butcher's wit strikes our crotchety old assholes once again. I cast fist. I personally find it quite humorous. Skeletor, of course you would, you old fart. Never you mind that, you should come up to my lab soon. I think I am close to making a breakthrough with the whole skin generation stage, and I need your ridiculous sight to help me out. Big D, finally cracked it, eh? Sure, I will come by just as soon as I am done soothing the dreams of the people I butchered. Skeletor, fine, as long as you don't get stuck doing something inane like discussing philosophy with a dragon, I can wait. Lizard Wizard, I will have you know, young man, that dragons are excellent philosophers. Skeletor, please tell me he is fucking with me. Big D. Skeletor, Raven. Big D, gotta go. See you all whenever bye. I cut off the flow of magic from the orb just as Phineas starts stringing curses in increasingly morbid ways. A bolt whizzes dangerously close to my face as Tiberius forces another blast of wind from within and falls over, his magicka completely spent. Excellent work, men. I clap my hands, give him 5 minutes, and then start again. My marksmen let out a gleeful cheer and start tossing coins amongst each other, all of them having made bets on who would get a hit and how many. Surprisingly, this was the first time no bolt reached the mentally scarred Imperial as he glared at me from his comfy little bed of dirt and grass. To think it would take you close to 26 hours of practice to finally not get hit once. I tisk and shake my head. Feralda would be appalled. Even as he twitches reflexively at the memory of the name, the bags under his eyes seem to grow deeper as he realizes just how long he had been at it. With breaks, of course, I am a monster, but not quite that big of one. He takes a deep breath, and his glare slowly moves to my side. This can't be legal. Zarok, who was standing next to me, pointedly looks anywhere but at my hand, currently using the General's written orders as a fan to cool myself. I am afraid the General has made it legal, sir. Thorfinn and Garm were too busy laughing their asses off to comment. How can this be called training? This is torture. Tiberius complains despite the consequences. And why is that asshole not included? He points at a wheezing Thorfinn. Because battle mage. He uses the title mockingly. I kept up my fucking defenses. Imagine dying to a fucking javelin. I lament, a mage from Winterhold, the only college in the civilized world that is worth a damn, dead to a fucking javelin. All right, fine. Tiberius tries to snarl, but his tired voice just makes him sound defeated. I will keep practicing defensive magic regularly, satisfied? I am indeed very satisfied that you will take your life more seriously. I nod a couple of times, but I also told you what happens when you complain, so... I pause dramatically and slowly turn to the marksmen. Boys, round 16. Another cheer breaks out amongst the crossbowmen, but Tiberius had at least learned that little lesson already, so he was well and truly running by the time the first clip of bolts was inserted. More mead, my lord? The handmaiden of Azura under contract with Tiberius asks almost cheerfully. Certainly. I accept happily and watch the entertainment play out. The following morning greeted me with a sense of foreboding. Whatever I had dreamed was not pleasant at all, and I sensed it was not limited to merely my imagination. Our forest encampment shuffled slowly as people started getting up from their rest. We were posted deep in the woods so as to avoid the debilitating sea fogs and were hidden enough to allow our men to rest well after each day. That slowness was thoroughly shattered, however, as a messenger burst into the camp's center carrying a request from Tullius and giving it to me without a word. Just for the sake of being paranoid, I gave it a quick scan, and once that showed no fuckery to be present, I flicked the scroll open and gave it a rapid read. The Stormcloaks were posturing for another attack, and Tullius suspected that it wasn't just the usual saber rattling of the past couple of days. Another big battle was about to break out, but to my surprise, the general bid me to remain in the forest, as Ulfric seemed to be trying to drown the trees in people with how many forces he was investing in pushing through. Likely predicting my concerns, the old Imperial told me they would just have to deal if Ulfric decided to take to the field once more. I was much more needed down here because he had decided it was time to finally be done with this slaughter. My orders were simple. I was to turn this forest into a proper charnel house and butcher any poor fucker unlucky enough to be anywhere in an approximate radius around me. Once I was done, I was to push out of the forest and strike their base camp, forcing the rest of the army into retreat and then into utter defeat. The gambit, if it can even be called that, was a rather simple one. Kill the enemy with high-intensity attrition tactics involving elite forces and then punch through, following the momentum all the way unto victory. Utterly idiotic in most cases, as you usually did not have troops so far above your enemy in quality on demand. Unfortunately for the rebels, I was here, and more than willing to follow through. True, it would be my first true mass slaying of the intelligent living, but in the long run it would greatly diminish how much food Alduin would get out of the war. So if I was being honest, the thousands of lives and likely souls that would meet their end today were perfectly acceptable compared to the alternative. For the first time in a very long time, I offered an idle prayer for the souls of those I was about to bring utter destruction to, and after taking one last fortifying puff of my cigar, I straightened up and called out to Oren. 'Twas time for grim work. Both Scorch and I decided as one. General POV. A column of highly alert warriors of Skyrim marched through the thin forest paths, and at their head marched a full unit of the heroes of the Great War. The veterans only convinced to join the fight after their reluctance started to cause accidents for their families, and the authorities all seemed to be incredibly oblivious about everything that was happening. None of them were idiots, but understood that politics were neither clean nor honorable, so they simply accepted their lot and took up their old arms and armor once again. At least that went for the actually reluctant ones. The rest were more than happy to finally be taken out of the reserves so they could fight for their liberty against their no doubt PTSD-induced hatred for all things elven. The path seemed to widen by a large margin as they stepped out into a vast forest clearing. Their eyes met with only vibrant green grass and a lonely figure standing atop the slight rise in the clearing's center. The figure was leaning on what looked to be a glaive, with a long purple strip of cloth attached to just below its blade and waving freely in the wind. Even the slowest-minded among the rebels took only a moment to recognize the terror they were unlucky enough to behold, and the entire 500-man strong line froze. The silence seemed to stretch for what felt like years, as no one was quite brave enough to speak before the visage of death before them gave leave. Was it only fear, or did the Nords feel actual respect for the one to face down heroes such as Ulfric and Grimnir? Finally, a light voice resounded across the field, almost reluctantly, "I will give you but one chance." Glowing red eyes opened and sent further terror down the spines of every man and woman present. "Surrender yourselves, or be slain to the last." Silence once more descended upon the lines of rebels. Many of them wanted to take the offer, but none was quite so brave to face the peer pressure of being the first to accept. But their chance was soon snatched away as one of the veterans was bestowed with an unfortunately firm spine as she grabbed her axe and bellowed, "Sovngarde." The figure of Lord Dagoth remained perfectly still as ravenous winds descended upon her and shred her to pieces. A sound, almost akin to a defeated sigh, resounded across the battlefield, and the entire unit was assaulted with the sudden urge to blink. By the time they did so, the figure was gone. 50 men were already dead by the time they realized just where their target now was. Soon the entire forest erupted into battle, with perfectly positioned Imperial forces descending upon their foes with immense efficiency of slaughter. All of their movements and even losses were pre-planned, as if they were merely following a path outlined for them by a higher power. Such a slaughter would have been a thing of eternal glory, had they not been killing their brothers. Raven's POV. By the time I buried my sword into the gut of the 2568 Stormcloak, the blood seemed to almost be trying to resist my robe's enchantment, trying to stick to me almost like some kind of curse. The sash, gifted to me by Torrig all those years ago, seemed 10 times as heavy as I waded through the sea of corpses. My houseguard and the rest of the forest detachment following behind me, finishing off everyone who was unlucky enough to still live. No one spoke, or even made much noise for that matter, as we stepped out of the woods in all our bloodied glory, the Stormcloak camp, and thus victory firmly in our sights. Chapter 295, Chapter 21, Battle of Dawnstar, A Broken Fist, A Shattered Rebellion. We did not slow down as we emerged from the forest canopy. Whatever few reserves still remained outside were cut down just as swiftly as their comrades before them. My emotions were a numb mess as I simply continued advancing toward the main enemy base, lazily batting the hastily redirected artillery shots coming from that direction. At this point, I was completely focused on simply being done with this whole fucking thing once and for all, and any poor fucker who thought it a good idea to get in my way would get his just reward for such a glaring display of intellect. My frustration grew as more and more of the fuckers redirected their hastily assembled ballistae toward us in some foolish attempt at slowing us down. I did not even bother holding back as I summoned Magnus's staff and proceeded to rake the entire wall of dirt and wood with crimson lightning, creating an opening and completely demolishing a good chunk of their defensive positions. Even as panic started to spread and the troops still engaging with Tullius's forces started to notice, I did not stop casting my increasingly destructive barrage. A unit of mages who were held back in reserve tried countering me with their pitiful wards, but those were cracked through without pause by the divine implement. They did not even get to scream as they were simply removed from existence. An officer of downright heroic bravery attempted to lead a sally out with 300 men at his back, all of them readying throwing axes as I came into their maximum effective range. This did not avail them as I ruthlessly pulled my free hand back and snapped their necks with their own shadows. That did take a massive chunk out of my magicka, but at this point, my regeneration was so utterly unnatural, even by the standards of Tamriel, that by the time another group of fools, who still refused to retreat, was incinerated, my tank was already back to being half full. Even more Stormcloaks stormed out of their by now utterly shattered defenses, even my ruinous spells not being enough to slow the desperate tide. Thankfully, I was not alone. The troops assigned to me, while balking at the sheer death tool at first, fell upon the demoralized enemy like an avalanche. The warriors of Winterhold cut through armor like paper with their enchanted weaponry while taking blows that would have cleaved them in half if not for their alteration-enhanced bodies. Their hands blazed with fire as they made up for their pitiful numbers with sheer skill and power. Enemy flanks were constantly assaulted by the Morthal contingent. The light troops, knowing well that they were not built for this kind of engagement, but they were more than happy to abuse the heavily armored rest of our contingent to hold the enemy in place long enough for their javelins and throwing axes to cause havoc in the enemy lines. And when that failed, the Marshmen were more than adept in hit-and-run tactics, their lighter armor allowing them to run for far greater lengths of time than the rest of us. The 54th almost seemed to be competing with me for how quickly they could bash through enemy defenses, Tiberius being too stuck in the moment to slow down and Zarok being duty-bound to not stop him from dying like an idiot. Indeed, this was all a scene from A Tale of Glory to the young Imperial as he leveraged his newly acquired skills to completely ignore any missile coming for his life and used his small army of Dremora to utterly butcher anything around him. His hands moved almost like a conductor as he cast conjuration-specific empowerment spells in the most opportune moments, allowing his troops to do more damage than I even thought possible for such low-level Daedra, and when that was not enough, he straight-up teleported them around, shattering any attempt at a cohesive response from our enemy. My houseguard contented themselves with marching behind me, their formation held in perfect order as Oren organized them into something that vaguely resembled a Spanish tercio formation, the wall of steel and death, stopping any of the more enthusiastic Nords from swarming me. It was almost adorable how the captain and his paladin friend kept themselves as close to me as possible in some funny attempt of protecting me. As if we were the ones in need of protection here. Scorch muttered darkly as I saw him flying above a group of retreating archers, the fire in his eyes looking particularly cruel at the moment. As I ascended the shattered walls, much of their height now being made up of rebel corpses, a furious roar caught my attention, and I suddenly stopped, just in time for an elaborately armored man to sail by my position, his two-handed blade missing me by a hair. I naturally immediately recognized him as Ulfric's son, the same idiot I'd met in Helgen. Unwilling to listen to the child's bluster, I simply kicked out as he was turning around, my magicka-enhanced foot meeting his armored face and crumpling his helmet with a loud crack. He was blown back, wounded and unconscious, but not dead. There goes my good deed for the day. I grumbled to myself and, letting the rest get to clearing out the enemy fort, turned to look at the wider battle still going on. In the distance, I could see Tullius's wooden fort barely standing, no doubt battered to hell and back by Ulfric and what remained of his tongues. But the fort still held, and I could see their lines slowly starting to break as smoke started to rise from our position. In fact, when I looked just a bit harder, my eyes met with those of Ulfric. He was probably unable to see me from this distance, but my sight was sharp enough to catch the dreadful realization entering his eyes as his entire cause slowly crumbled all around him. As he stood in that bloodied field of fresh spring grass, his mind no doubt supplying him with the fact that his retreat was nearly cut off, and that his bloodline was most likely ended, he made the only decision he could. He grabbed a horn hanging from his hip and sounded a fighting retreat. To the east, I could vaguely make out Galmar's advance stopping, and almost grudgingly starting to wilt as the veteran commander realized something catastrophic must have happened on the other fronts. Slowly, the rebel forces started pulling back, likely hoping that they would at least be able to retreat from this place if they managed to punch through our position, relying on the fact that the Imperial forces were all just as tired out as they were. Tullius and I would not permit them such fantasies. With a mental apology to the poor fuckers, I rose a hand upwards and sent a blast of bright golden flames into the skies, and watched with a mix of glee and regret as the cohorts still in the fight stilled completely before slowly backing off and moving to the sides. The Stormcloaks were briefly confused by the movement, but that only lasted them until they saw a full quarter of our forces arrayed for battle and charging straight at them, all of them fresh and motivated. And as if that was not enough, the charge was led by the madman Renaud, the knight's lance shining almost excitedly as he and his fellows dove into the now outright panicking ranks of rebels. The ordered retreat lost cohesion in minutes. The rout followed after only 10. The slaughter that came after lasted for hours. The dumbest of the rebels made a beeline toward their only retreat path, a singular passage from which they arrived in the first place. A place now very much positioned behind our backs. Hundreds and then thousands were cut down or incinerated as some were so panicked they straight up tried just running through our ranks like headless chickens. Thankfully for whatever remained of their dignity, Ulfric and Galmar managed to organize whatever was left of their forces and led them in much the same direction, only this time they had an actual chance of punching through as their pursuers were still a few minutes away, briefly distracted by another large unit surrendering. Fucker probably planned it too, fed them something about honor in helping their brothers escape, no doubt. Scorch's analytic drawl broke me from my musings briefly. Even he was done with this shit show. Shaking my head at his very likely statement, I prepared to show the irritating fuck the folly of his ways when he and a quartet of heavily armored men ran ahead of the formation and as one shouted, "Fus Rodar!" The shout of unrelenting force, weak as it was in comparison to my own, was directed straight at me and my personal troops behind me, and this infuriated me. My own voice boomed as I responded with my own unrelenting force, just barely dispersing the combined voice of 4 enraged Nords, but I did not stop there. No, just as the vibrating wave of force left my throat, I breathed in once more, the familiar bubbling of flame scratching against my chest as Flametongue made his name known once again, Yul Torshul. The dragonfire seemed to have actual weight as it completely rearranged the ground it passed, glassing the whole damn thing and slamming into the rebel lines and consuming hundreds in a mere instant. Ulfric survived just barely as his fellow tongues focused fully on protecting him, paying with their lives in the process. I did not wait for words to be exchanged, nor did I need to offer any kind of command to my men, as both sides decided it was well and truly time to end each other's lives. Bolts flew all around me, one even coming close to hitting me in the back, but only bounced off my armor as I angled slightly to the side. Well, that cunt is getting his pay docked, I thought with some annoyance as I burst in front of Ulfric and wordlessly swung out with blasphemy. The Stormcloak had already finished invoking elemental fury with his voice and went to parry my attack, but I simply blinked behind him and slammed the blade into his back, his enchanted armor the only thing saving his life as multiple ribs were shattered on impact, and he was sent flying away. Immediately I went to finish him off, but was forced to back off when a massive bear of a man slammed his equally massive axe into the ground where I would have been had I continued. Galmar Stonefist glared at me with hatred I probably deserved at this point, and with a bestial growl and bloodshot eyes, Ulfric's right-hand man started wailing at me. I had to focus all of my skill and power onto defense as the crazy motherfucker hit harder and faster than Harkon. Whatever berserk rage fueled him, bringing out every single possible iota of strength the man possessed. I was gripped with genuine fascination as I could watch his muscles tearing themselves apart in real time, only to swiftly be repaired with a downright deadly dose of regeneration potion currently sloshing through his body. The two of us became a storm of slashes and parries as my combat precognition battled his sheer unending rage. Galmar Stonefist definitely earned his name, as even when his axe was shattered, his bare fucking fists managed to keep up with me, even if it did ultimately cost him the battle. My muscles burned under the onslaught, even as a wall of both wind and flame skinned him alive, and my bones creaked even as the berserker was almost drained of blood by the dagger jutting out of his thigh. Suddenly, I felt my foot slip on a pool of blood, and for the briefest of moments, my guard slipped with it. I almost sighed with resignation as the burned fist sailed for my face, no doubt about to cause me a whole lot of pain, only to suddenly stop as a sword of golden moonstone slipped under his armpit. Paladin Anandor kicked the now corpse of Galmar with barely hidden contempt and looked at me. "Are you well, my lord?" he asked calmly. Shaking myself out of the surprise the sudden intervention took me by, I nodded. Before my eyes narrowed in suspicion, I soon found my target and saw 4,000 or so remaining Stormcloaks pushing through the lines of the men of Morthal, a prominent group among them dragging Ulfric between them. Thinking about it briefly, I shrugged and turned to the rest of the battle. His time will come, and the more he fled, the lesser the impact of his death would be. We were too busy holding off another retreating group to aid them, my lord. Anandor escapes hastily as the rebels ascend the passage and a duo of still-living magi collapse it behind them. He must have expected me to scold him for what happened, because when I just started laughing my ass off, his expression turned from shame to confusion, and then to worry. Finally finished with my sudden fit of laughter, I wiped the tears from my eyes with a final chuckle and shook my head. Fucker is a better escape artist than he is a leader. That much is for certain. Before Anandor could speak again, I found a nearby tree stump and plopped my ass down with a tired sigh. I don't care he escaped. He is only waiting for his execution now. The rebellion is done, I proclaim wistfully, startling many of the men and women unsubtly listening in. I just hope it was fucking worth it. Chapter 296, Chapter 40. Don't make me come up there. With my rush of adrenaline finally settling, I found myself staring into the distance while chain-smoking without even noticing it at first. The day's events replayed in my mind even as a full hour passed and the troops were busying themselves dealing with the bodies and giving medical aid to the wounded. The only times I would be distracted from my mental descent were when a dying legionary was brought before me, only to be removed just as quickly as I brute-forced them back to full health. At least it helped me from getting truly high with how many cigars I went through. Either from the aforementioned dying soldiers or from the blood that was still slowly and ever so reluctantly seeping from my person, a small pool of blood now surrounded the small tree stump I was seated on, the surrounding smell of waste and viscera, blessedly blocked out by a light wind I called forth with my blessings. Aside from the mortally wounded, None save Anandor came close to me, the ancient paladin holding a silent vigil while I accepted the fact that thousands of men and women died by my hand in mere hours. Not the degenerated Fulmer or the reanimated Draga, not even forsworn barbarians. No, it was actual people, or at least what I considered to be people in any case. How endlessly noble of you, Pops, Scorch drawls with immense amusement. I scoff lightly. Everyone is a hypocrite, at least I openly admit it. Uh-huh. He somehow manages to maneuver his face into a perfect deadpan. You openly admit it in your sulky internal monologue. I do not sulk. I immediately bite back before pausing, my expression slowly shifting into one of disgusted horror. Oh God, I am sulking, aren't I? Birdboy shrugs. Considering you just committed what those fuckers back then would probably consider a cardinal fucking sin, I don't think mere sulking is the worst you could be doing right now. Jesus fucking Christ, Scorch, I mutter. I could not have put it more repugnantly if I tried. I can probably do better if you let me think, he informs me with too much happiness. We stare at each other for a whole minute before I sigh in defeat. Dear gods, we really are terrible people. Always have been. He bobs his head smugly. As one, we turn to Anandor, who was standing there and listening the entire time. We had forgotten he was even there by this point. The old elf notices immediately and offers a sad smile. All of us cope with what we must do in different ways, my lord. He inclines his head slightly. Even back in our ancient conflict with the Atmarans, such deeds weighed heavily on the magi and champions of our people. But I do admit it was to a much lesser degree, what with numbers on both sides being much lower than they are in this age. I offer a thankful nod for his words and return to staring into the distance. Warfare, I have learned, is unfortunately just one big calculation. I begin lightly, our numbers versus theirs, our losses versus theirs, and so on and so forth. A pause. It is why I accepted Tullius's request so swiftly. You knew the consequences immediately and still chose to follow through, Anandor asks, his voice lacking any judgment. I did. I confirm easily. I could have held back even further than I did today, allowed the battle to drag on for weeks if I so chose, but in the end, I did not see any benefit in more loyalists dying needlessly. The paladin looks at me with a mix of surprised and aghast. You were still holding back, he mutters with a respectable amount of fear in his tone. Quite. I chuckle. Or did you think Ulfric escaped by chance? I raise an eyebrow. He stares at me for a while before finally managing a weak, but why? The rebellion is over, I restate firmly. They have lost far too many to death and surrender. Their outside support is crushed so thoroughly they would have to remake those contacts from scratch. All that is left is securing Torrig's legitimacy so thoroughly no Nord would even think of questioning him until he is well and truly dead at the ripe old age of 150. Realization starts to dawn in the ancient paladin's eyes. You mean to have the young king do the deed himself? Indeed, I nod. An assault on Windhelm will be more than easy, now that their garrison has been so thoroughly depleted, and my own people already run the Grey Quarter. All that is left is to bring Torrig so that he may execute Ulfric like the cowardly dog he is, and then we can focus on the true enemy. Anandor nods gravely. Auriel's children who have strayed from his brilliant light. And the Thalmor. I raise a finger in lecture, can't forget those deranged kinsmen of ours. I once held all our distant kin in high regard. He shakes his head in genuine sadness. To think all but the descendants of the Chimera would turn themselves to madness. I scoff, don't think the Dunmer are free of it either. I correct him immediately. House Dagoth is the way it is because of my own beliefs. Until relatively recently, the Dunmer of Morrowind were a bunch of religious extremist slavers. Their so-called Almsivi, the living gods drawing their power from the betrayal they committed upon the chosen champion of our people, and that they committed against my own ancestor when he learned of their deeds. You hold your own people in such disdain? Anandor asks, taken aback. Oh, please. I scoff even more loudly. To some of them, even a mer of my station would still be considered a noir, simply because I was not born in Morrowind. And don't even get me started on the great houses. I shake my head. The Redarin are all right, I guess. Their views of honor and martial prowess are respectable, but a bit too far-reaching for my tastes. The Indoril are opportunistic zealots who switched sides the moment their precious tribunal temple fell. I practically spit the words out, having no respect for Almalexia's house before continuing to the rest. The Telvanni are just a bunch of unprincipled, lawless sorcerers. The Dres are filthy slavers. The Hlalu got so greedy they were replaced by Sadras. And Dagoth. I sigh. What is now a beacon of progress and prosperity, as remade by my own hands, was once the tool of a maddened lich. For I have no better way to describe his state, who declared himself a god. A dry chuckle leaves me, a god who was so deluded with himself, he outright created my father to be his inheritor, so that he may have a legacy on the earth as he ruled from the heavens. Your legacy may have come from darkness, but Ariel himself has decreed you to be a bringer of light for all to see. Anandor declares immediately as I pause. Oh, don't think I am all that hung up on the madman. I wave him off with a chuckle. I was merely pointing out just how low all myrrh seemed to have sunk throughout history, not just those we don't like. Much like the snow elves in our own way. Anandor mutters darkly before the mood leaves him in the blink of an eye, and he offers me a supportive smile. It is good that you are not weighed down by such things, my lord, but it may be time to address our visitor. He pointedly looks behind me. Enjoyed your little spying session, Rika? I ask without turning around. I had noticed her the moment she approached, but it wasn't like I had anything to hide, and going by her expression, she wasn't all that interested in my words either. The veteran legate merely gives me a dirty look at that before focusing back on her target. After a brief moment of silence, she finally catches herself and hoarsely asks, "Is that?" Giving a brief look at the absolutely ruined corpse of Ulfric's right-hand man, I nod. Galmar Stone Fist himself. Died like he lived, a complete and utter beast of a man. A small smile appears on her face at those words, before she approaches the pile of shredded meat and bone and looks down at it somberly, completely uncaring for the blood now soaking her boots. We were comrades once, she mutters in remembrance, fought against the Thalmor with all we had. To think we would end up like this. He made his choice. I cut in sharply but not harshly. He knew damn well what his support would do to his own people, and for all his courage, he was as easily blinded by the short term as Ulfric still no doubt is. Rika gives the corpse a sad nod. That he did. She agrees hesitatingly. At least he feasts with Talos now. The moment she realizes what she had just said, her eyes snap to me, looking almost startled. Naturally, that crumbles immediately as she sees me giving her the most deadpan look I could manage at the moment. Woe, I must now inform the ambassador of your great sin. My voice could have probably dried the oceans at that moment. Her eye twitches before a very unexpected snort, sounding hilariously close to that of a pig, comes out against her control. She immediately clamps her hand over her nose, but it was already too late. I completely ignored her glare as I laughed my ass off and allowed my self-judgment to slowly slide off my back. I would probably get a couple of nightmares before my mind settled, but at least those were thematic around these parts. The mood in the legionary camps was both solemn and celebratory. Thousands on our side had died in the great battle, but at the same time, we utterly crushed the rebels with a good 4-to-1 ratio in our favor, and that was not counting the prisoners. Still, it took us a whole 2 days to reposition and deal with all the corpses. No one wanted to deal with a damn plague of all things now that we were on the cusp of victory. Most of the legionaries and hold warriors still treated me with their usual respect, but those who had fought at my side were thoroughly scarred by what happened. The men and women of Morthal were scared shitless and outright demanded they be placed into a camp away from the one I was staying at due to a newly developed superstition, a rather funny little story of people dying if I stared at them for a moment too long. The 54th and Tiberius were much milder in their reactions. I did have a reputation in solitude, and all of them saw me go wild before. They were still frightened by me, but it was more of a better do whatever he says kind of fear than the run the fuck away kind. As for my own people, well, I guess that the mentality difference between men and elves was on a level both cultural and genetic, because all I could see in their eyes was pure, unfiltered admiration. By Dagoth, some of the lesser pyromancers finally managed to cast fireballs just because of what they saw me do. Bunch of fucking lunatics, Scorch evidently approved. In any case, we had a 2-day break before Tullius started planning on assaulting the city, but I found myself with a much better idea all of a sudden, as I felt a sentry almost shit himself with fear once I stepped a tad too close to the city walls. And so I found myself approaching the gates of Dawnstar, Anondor, Thorfinn, and Tiberius at my flanks. I did make sure to tell Tullius to summon the twins from Solitude before I did so, however. I could practically taste the fear of the guards rising as I approached the city. The only thing stopping them from either attacking or running was the ornate white flag held by my paladin. Just to fuck with them further, I stood there silently for a good 10 minutes. This evidently caused a good fifth of the city to slowly approach a panic. So much so that the cunt Scald found it within himself to climb atop the gatehouse, albeit reluctantly. "What in oblivion do you want?" he yelled, not as scared as his men to his credit. "Is that any way to greet your King's Court mage, Scald?" I asked cheerfully, but sadly he did not have the sheer gall to correct me on this. They had spyglasses and minor seers in the city. They knew damn well what happened outside their walls. He sighs as his hand twitches toward his axe on instinct. "Just say what you will, Dagoth." "Much better." I clap my hands, a couple of the gate guards almost jumping away at the action. "My offer is simple." I smile as my crown covers my face. "Get your fat behind outside this fucking gate, right fucking now, or I will make what happened to Ulfric's little posse look like a fucking picnic." My words struck true, but the good Jarl was still a bit reluctant. "Don't make me come up there, Skald, or by all the divines, I will fulfill my promise of gelding your bald ass." The Jarl pales as his eyes dilate in pure fear. It did not take him a minute to have the gate open, and he practically sprinted outside to present his weapon to me. That is what I fucking thought, bitch. Chapter 297, Chapter 33, Jarls, Clans, and Priests. With a complete lack of care for the supposed solemnity of the situation, I took Skald's axe and started flipping it in my hand while looking down at the kneeling man. For a moment I debated just cracking his head open for being such a massive idiot and leading thousands of his people to die, but that thought disappeared as quickly as it came. No, wasting effort for this prick just wouldn't do. "Get up," I command and offer the axe to Tullius, who had approached with his group behind me. "Court mage." The general greets me with a nod. "I see your proposition worked." Startled by Tullius's words, Skald steps back. "What do you mean, his proposition?" he asks, genuinely bewildered. "Personally." Tullius glares at him. "I would have preferred the city pacified more thoroughly." He looks over the men and women slowly descending the battlements and laying down their arms. "But the court mage convinced me that our thorough victory was more than enough to ensure your submission." His commanding glare seemed to apply actual weight on the now deposed Jarl. "Was I mistaken, Skald?" He rapidly shakes his head. "Of course not, General. You can be assured order will be upheld." He winces and gives me a look. "Just please make sure no one gets burned." It starts as a low chuckle, but is soon replaced as a full-blown laugh that seems to scare the surrendering troops even more than my earlier threat. "Oh, don't worry your bald head about it, Skald." My mirthful look turns to a glare. "It was you and your fellow rebels who forced me into butchering people by the thousands after all." He gulps and nods. "What? What is to become of me?" At this, Tullius gives me a look to which I shrug. "You will be brought before the High King, where you will be given a fair trial." I pause briefly and pretend to ponder something, although you should already be aware of the punishment that awaits you. To my surprise, his earlier fear seems to leave him as he offers a much firmer nod of acceptance this time. I am aware. He almost manages to keep his voice level, but a hint of fear still comes out. "Good," I say a bit darkly. "So long as you do not try anything stupid, you may just meet your ancestors with honor." Not waiting for a response, I turn around and fire a blast of ice into the air, and moments later, distant sounds of marching follow. The city was ours. I planned on immediately finding the priest of Mara, who should have a bit more information on the Vaermina situation in the lighthouse, but unfortunately I was immediately dragged off to the Jarl's keep by Tullius. It would seem that the politicking was not yet done, as we found ourselves seated around a long table, with Skald present unarmed, but yet unbound. Across Tullius and I sat an older Nord woman, flanked by a standing bald and clean-shaven man wearing older imperial plate armor, and a person who I was not aware, yet could immediately guess the identity of, was sitting to her side. A tall Nord man with a familiar shade of blonde hair. The loyalist representative Brina Merilis was the first to speak, beginning with the pleasantries. "I am glad to see the Empire did not hesitate to deal with this rebellion so promptly. Further fighting would have torn the spirit of our people irreparably." "Quite." Tullius hums non-committedly. "The Emperor's subjects fighting amongst each other is an unacceptable travesty." I interrupt the waste of my time by clearing my throat. "Thane Brina Merilis, Housecarl Horic Halfhand, and Clanhead Belor Flameheart." I make eye contact with each as I name them, specifically pausing at the mage. "I trust that I will not have to deal with people claiming that you are not, in fact, the chosen representatives of Dawnstar in the name of King Torrig?" I ask leadingly. The Thane frowns momentarily, but immediately hides it, while Belor doesn't even bother hiding his irritation. "Horic?" Well, Horic was just looking at me with a grin. As before, it is Brina that speaks. "We have held a proper election, as is due when a Jarl is changed. And you have been chosen in his stead." I stare at the war veteran for a while, causing her some slight discomfort. Good. The last time I did this, I had to deal with a whiny child, better left to Cyrodiil's politicking than ruling a hold. A veteran should be easier to deal with. But the world seems to always take that as a challenge, so I will not be holding my breath. My completely dry delivery seems to take the two nobles aback momentarily. Horic just lets out a wet snort. Brina cautiously looks over to Tullius and silently clears her throat to catch his attention. "Pardon me, General, but who among the two of you holds the authority to finalize the transfer of the title?" Tullius seemingly doesn't so much as twitch, but things are different to my trained eye as I notice him hiding a smirk. The court mage holds civil authority in the name of the High King. A general would only take command in military matters, or if there was no other representative present. I let out a light chuckle. "There is no need to fear the big bad Dunmer," I say with only slight mockery, "just making sure everything is on the up and up before handing over the reins, as you are quite literally incapable of lying to me." Belor speaks for the first time. "Wait, that wasn't a lie?" My deadpan stare almost makes him flinch. "No." Brina visibly relaxes at that. "That is good to hear. No offense, court mage, but you do have something of a reputation here. You can just say you are scared shitless and be done with it." I point out dryly, causing her housecarl to laugh at her, which in turn earned the bald man a glare. "Right." I shake my head. "Let us get all of this over and done with. I will accept your oath, and then I can get to dealing with the obvious vermin and Daedric infestation happening in your lighthouse." All of them pale as one as I drop the information, and Brina immediately gets to work. Never in my life have I held a more efficient ceremony. I leave the newly sworn-in Jarl and her housecarl with Tullius, with Flameheart following behind me. "What did you wish to discuss, court mage?" he asks, still failing to hide his dislike of me. Oh, the man was perfectly respectful, but me being the only reason he and his kin did not join the rebellion was grating on his nerves more than his reasonable fear of me was keeping them at bay. Also, effectively keeping his kids as hostages in the Legion probably did not help. Before I answer, I let out a sharp whistle, making the mage immediately become guarded and causing one of my agents to appear from the nearby shadows. The agent kneels and bows his head. "Your command." Still staring at the frightened clan head, I say, "Summon the twins. They should be with the new arrivals from the docks." "By your will." Jackal bows deeper and disappears. As he does so, Belor glares at me. "Was there any purpose to this demonstration, court mage?" "Not really." I shrug. "Just felt like annoying the cunt who has been stealing my friend's achievements and wealth for the past few years." His face reddens immediately. "Those two traitors have no right." The sudden glow coming from my eyes stops him in his tracks. Go on then. I smile eerily, insult my friends again. My face is an inch from his as he refuses to so much as twitch. House Dagoth will be more than willing to accommodate your idiocy and accept the feud with your clan. He immediately steps back as his eyes widen. That way won't be necessary. Exactly as I thought. I nod contentedly. Now, as you may have expected, your earlier leanings will have consequences, however slight. He stares at me for a moment before sighing, What are your demands? Good. It would seem that you aren't a total idiot. I smile. Kicking a dead horse there, Pops. Let me have my fun. I keep my eye from twitching. I am going to be taking the twins with me to solve the nightmare issue your city is beset with. After their glorious return, you will step down and allow Boar to take your position. Any deviation from this very simple course of events will see your clan brought to ruin. Do I make myself clear? Had I not been who I was, that would have probably earned me a fireball to the face, but all the man could do was grit his teeth and force out a crystal court mage. Most excellent. I clap my hands. Now smile, your kids haven't seen you for over a year. Before he can process my words, two individuals with the same shade of blonde hair, clad in legionary battle mage armor, step into the side street we were in. Boar and Brienne looked much the same as the last time I saw them, but their demeanors were much diminished, their mere presence in their home city seemingly sucking the life out of them. Ignoring the building tension between father and children, I raise my hand lazily. Sup. Both of them startle, but once their attention falls to me, their reactions are completely different. Brienne smiles radiantly and goes in for a quick hug, while Boar seemingly holds back a glare. So how have you two been? I ask, uncaring for the brother's mood. Legionary life has been fine, I guess. Brienne shrugs, not to mention the pay. She adds, but I think I will prefer it when everything calms down and we can go back to our adventuring. As if we had a choice, Boar grinds out, now actually glaring at me. 4,312, I state simply. He blinks. What? 4,312. I repeat a bit slower this time while giving him an eerie look. That is how many people I have slain in less than 4 hours. The statement stuns all three of them utterly. Tell me, Boar, how would you have liked it if your family was added to that number? Whatever comments or rants he had probably been keeping bottled up for months now die before they leave his mouth as he simply gapes at me, his sister giving me a sad look instead. Right, I shake my head. You said you wanted adventuring, right? I smile. How about you join me for a little trip to the nearby lighthouse? It did not take much to convince the duo to follow me on my mad quest, as Boar jokingly called it, and the three of us soon found ourselves walking toward one of the local inns. Our search was short, and after only stopping once to ask for directions, we stepped in on the scene of a Dunmer in the priestly robes of Mara, comforting an old man. Do not let these false images shake your faith, Yolf. He pats his shoulder comfortingly. Hold yourself to the teachings of the divine, and the nightmares will soon dissipate. The old Nord nods gratefully. Of course, Erendur. I thank you for your words. As they share some more words and the Nord leaves, the priest focuses on all of us, his eyes immediately zeroing in on me. It takes him a moment, but as soon as he realizes who he is looking at, he bows deeply. Welcome to Dawnstar, Lord Dagoth. How may I assist you? I raise a surprised eyebrow at the welcome, but get over it easily enough. I have come to deal with the nightmare issue. I state without preamble, I have been informed that you are inordinately knowledgeable on the topic. He holds back a slight wince before slowly nodding. I have been researching the nightmares for some time now, Sergio. Researching, you say? I trail of while giving him a knowing look. Tell me what you know then, Casimir. The moment I mention his real name, his face pales, catching him so off guard he fails to keep his mouth shut. Shit. By the time he realized he essentially admitted to me being right, it was already far too late, and knowing this he let his shoulders slump in defeat. You've caught me. I know far more than I let on. That is good to hear, I smile. How about you enlighten us with that knowledge, so that we may liberate the good people of this fine city, He stares at me for a long, surprised moment before smiling in turn. I will be more than happy to help banish that creature. Oh, but I wanted to threaten him. Scorch whines petulantly. His eyes look delicious. Sigh. Chapter 298. Chapter 25. Nightcaller. My consciousness returns partly as I absently note it, moving through innumerable images, scenes I have seen, and those I have not, changing, mixing, evolving before my very eyes. The scene shifts once more, and I find myself standing atop a veritable sea of corpses, all of them clad in a familiar blue sash splayed over their different armor styles. As I notice the shift, so too do the corpses, as all of their eyes snap open, a chilly blue flame replacing their once lively orbs. They say nothing, but I still hear their accusations of thousands of orphans and widows made, of their souls being fed to the world ender, of a monster without mercy taking them well before their time. One grabs my leg, and I find myself unable to shake the death grip off. All of the power I know I should have missing in its entirety, as more and more corpses start throwing themselves over each other in an attempt to grab and bite their enemy. My ability to move was swiftly removed, as I soon found myself drowning in a sea of blood, bone, and teeth, pain that was not pain assailing all of my senses. My eyes snap open. I stare at the wooden ceiling of the room the new Jarl assigned to me as my breathing slowly calms down. I remain silent for a long moment, contemplating what had just happened. The things I was just forced to experience. Motherfucking piece of noir shit. I curse as I practically jump out of my bed, my robes appearing in that same fluid motion. I swear I am going to murder a bitch today if it is the last damned thing I do. Of fucking course she was already influencing me, took her damn time too. I growl. Well, so much for not being a dick about banishing her, I guess. The sound of a throat being cleared draws me from my burgeoning rant as my eyes snap to a figure seated at a small nearby table. Mephis's bright eyes burrowing into me with amusement as the Daedra spoke. My oh my, Raven. Is this how you welcome a dear guest? Shut. I immediately snap, and the puppet's mouth is forced closed. Naturally, this does not deter her whatsoever, as the amusement in her eyes only seems to burn even more brightly at the action. Pointedly ignoring her fidgeting, I sigh and remove the command. Apologies for that. I am evidently more stressed than I thought. Oh, think nothing of it. She waves me off daintily. Considering how I've seen mortals react to such thing throughout the ages, you are doing quite well, in fact. She pauses and cups her face as if in thought. Then again, you aren't quite all that mortal anymore. Right, I drawl out and wipe the slight sheen of sweat off my brow. Was there any point to your visit? Why, yes, there is indeed. She smiles happily. I just wanted to confirm that Vermina has noticed your intentions as soon as you entered the city's surroundings and has tried empowering her little cult beneath the temple. My eyebrow shoots up, and when you say tried... Naturally, I stopped the uppity little bitch immediately. She preens momentarily before pouting slightly. Of course, some of her power still got through, but not as much as he wanted. And what will this cost me? I sigh. Nothing. She shoots with zero hesitation. Nothing? I look at her like she is an idiot. Mephala was the singular person in the world, bar some gods probably, who could still lie to me, so my skepticism was through the roof, to say the least. I just want you to do what you were going to do already. She smiles happily. I don't even need you to get me that pitiful little staff either. You do realize... I begin slowly, that I could have just dealt with whatever additional fuckery she was going to throw at me, and that your desire to not owe me for whatever you may gain from that is rather obvious, do you not? Her smile seems to somehow turn even brighter. But tell me, Raven, after whatever you just went through, do you want to deal with more nightmare fuckery, as you call it? I stare at her for a long while, trying to look disapproving, but that failed to convince me, much less her. Before long, I allow my shoulders to slump as I give her a weak glare. Why do I even bother arguing with you? I know, right? She bobs her head. As I always say, things would be much easier if you just decided to trust me. She tilts her head lightly, though they would be much less fun. My eye twitches, but I know better than to indulge her further. Right, I drawl out. I truly am happy my suffering has been entertaining to you. The air in the room suddenly turns much colder than before as spiderwebs start forming at the edges of my senses as Mephala voice shifts from happy to frigid. That little bitch decided to attack my chosen dear. The tiny edge to her tone informs me of just how much frothing rage she is holding back. Kindly show her the error of her ways, will you? Now that we can do. I met Erendur and the twins at the halfway point to the lighthouse and the abandoned temple attached to its foundation. All three of them looked worse for wear after having slept through Vermina's increased activity. The Maran priest's plan was a good one, all things considered, as he recommended we take a rest and not immediately rush into the temple so that we aren't caught inside in the middle of the night when the Daedra's power waxes to its peak. Sadly, neither he nor I were able to predict the fact that one of the Daedra generally considered to be absent and less inclined toward direct action was able to suss us out within mere hours. If I took a bit more time to consider her MO, I'd have probably realized it sooner, but merely spending time where someone was sleeping would potentially put you at risk of being noticed, especially in a city where her artifact has been going at it for decades. I handed out stamina potions to all of them, pushing out most of their physical fatigue, but failing to hold back the mental pressure they were under. Brienne was looking especially shaken, likely having seen something that she could not quite get over. As we walked, Bor spoke up, "Erandur, or was it Casimir?" "Erandur, please," the priest corrects swiftly. "I left that other name with the cult." "Why would you even join them in the first place?" the Nord asks, obviously wanting to be rid of the relative silence of our passing. The Dunmer looks into the distance briefly and shakes his head. "I was young and foolish. Add to that they practically raised me. There was no real choice in the matter. It is by mere luck that I have escaped such a life." "Luck? What do you mean?" Brienne barges into the conversation. "Yes, sheer dumb luck." The aged priest nods, a wry smile on his face. The artifact guarded within Nightcaller Temple had chosen another target for its ravenous master. Vermina always hungers for memories, you see. A band of Orsimer were thus cursed with vivid nightmares for weeks. It did not take the orcs long to find the source of their troubles and infiltrate the city to attack the temple directly. He pauses as a group of guards pass us by, all of them offering a quick salute and getting as far away from us as possible. As they disappear behind a nearby corner, Erandur continues his tale, but the priests of the temple were just that, priests. The orcs would have overpowered the defenses with ease, and so they chose to contaminate it with what they considered a sacred miasma, a gas that puts all into a time-frozen sleep at the cost of their sanity. "Fucking cultists," Bor scoffs disdainfully. "Huffing a maddening gas sounds like a great idea." To an outsider, it may seem so. Erandur explains patiently, but to those who wish to forget, it is a sacred rite, however misguided. He quickly adds that last part when I turn to him with a raised eyebrow. "Also," Brienne cuts in once more, "Nightcaller Temple, really? How did no one realize what was happening?" This time it is I who interjects. "Because, Brienne, it is a ruin and most Nords don't like touching those with an army at their back." "Back to my question," Bor interrupts before I can tear his entire city a new one. "How did you get away?" Erandur looks around briefly. "I was the one tasked with releasing the miasma. I was far enough to see its effects, and they terrified me. I escaped as soon as I saw the gas taking effect," he admits shamefully. "And lacking an echo chamber for your idiotic faith, you soon found your way to good sense." I quip, to which he grumbles but does not disagree. "Yes," he draws the words out non-committedly. "Put further questions aside, we have arrived." And there it was, the lighthouse, well maintained on its upper levels, with outside stairs leading those in charge of keeping it lit and fueled up, with its base left completely unattended, making the temple it once housed look like a pile of rocks with a small door at the entrance. Erandur pushed open the stone doorway without preamble, leading us into a relatively sizable prayer chamber, a shrine to Mara sitting at its altar, likely having replaced whatever idol to Vermina that stood there before the orcish raid. "Is this it?" Bor asks impatiently. "No." Iranda answers almost harshly and goes to a large relief in the distant wall, channeling his magicka through a series of runes and activating the ward, which soon turned the stone intangible. The moment he did so, I immediately blasted the entire chamber with a massive wind cloak, too weak to damage anyone but more than strong enough to banish whatever fumes attempted to assail us, as the temple was opened for the first time in decades. Noticing his little fuck-up, Erendur gives us all sheepish looks. Apologies for that. I had thought the miasma would dissipate after so long. When dealing with Daedra, I have found that relying on the passage of time is rarely a good idea. I inform him and step into the depths, the confused groans of the waking orcs swiftly reaching my ears. A group of orcs were looking around with what was obviously illusion-induced paranoia, and the moment their eyes landed on us, they brought their weapons to bear and charged at us. Their minds were obviously lost to the quagmire by this point, so ending them could be considered a mercy. The twins and Eranda struggled against their foes, but I cut them all down with ridiculous ease. They were stronger than most humans, but their current state stopped them from using that strength effectively as, in their panic, they fell into the berserk rage inherent to their people. We descended deeper into the temple, soon facing against groups of both cultists and orcs, working in tandem as their minds were shattered, and they were dragged toward us like meat puppets. Suddenly, I stopped mid-swing and dodged back as a sword passed just where my neck was. But a moment ago, Boar blinked as he realized he was not where he remembered, and slowly turned toward me with a look of fear and confusion. I pointed my hand in his general direction and blasted out a concentrated firebolt, missing his face by an inch and blasting the final orc of this group to pieces. Brienne held back a gasp and let out a sigh of relief as she realized I wasn't about to murder her brother, and quickly ran up to him. "What was that?" she asked him. He trailed off, looking at me fearfully. "I don't know. I saw him as an orc trying to kill you." "Fucking illusions," I palmed my face. "Do you at least know how to resist them now that we know about them?" "I am afraid it will not be that simple." Erendur cuts in. "The illusions weaved by the Lady of Nightmares are far more potent than most mortal magics. I fear our wills will be greatly tested." "I see." I close my eyes and ponder this briefly before looking to Boar. "You can go back if you want. I'd rather not risk you committing suicide by me if you were too weak to resist this place." The young Nord grit his teeth and practically hissed at me. "I am no coward." I tilt my head. "Prove it then." At the obvious provocation, quickly letting Boar in on my plan, as he gave me a light glare and started walking deeper into the temple with an annoyed huff. Soon we stepped out into a circular chamber, the center of which lay open to all the different levels of the underground levels of the lighthouse tower, the most eye-catching detail being the many barriers drawn from the powerful staff floating at the bottom of the structure. It itself was encased within a barrier of far greater, visibly Daedric power. There it is, the skull of corruption. Erendur says with both fear and awe, the source of Dawnstar's woes and its nightmares. I'd rather say that the source of its woes was Scald, but we are not here to debate that. I quip lightly while glaring holes into the nightmare machine. Let's get rid of that filth. I haven't gotten a wink of actual sleep last night and do not plan on repeating the experience. A pair of enthusiastic "IS" comes from the twins. "Very well, follow me." The priest nods and continues leading the way. Just as we turn another corner, we are met with a bunch of orcs slamming their weapons into a transparent barrier. A massive specimen, which I guessed to be the chieftain, was growling at the passage with something resembling a more coherent hatred. The moment Erendur stepped just a bit too loudly, the entire group turned to us, and the chief snarled, "Filthy nightmare mongers!" He did not wait for us to attempt an explanation and launched himself at Brienne, who was closest to him. A blast of ice welcomed him, and the male twin's sword soon found its way into his neck. The rest of the orcs were as mindless as the rest of their kin, letting us cut them down with practiced ease, even as Erandur and Boar were wounded in the fighting, Brienne escaping injury only by virtue of being the support. We approached the shimmering barrier, and a moment later heard Erendur let out a light gasp of what sounded like fear. He quickly turned to us and shook his head. "I fear that this barrier is unbreakable to us. It is powered directly from the staff, which in turn draws power from the quagmire. Surely there is an alternative, Brienne asks hopefully. Boar huffs. Probably something stupid and reckless. Erendur's eye twitches as he looks to me. There is indeed a way to get through, but it is, as the young man just said, a tad reckless. I roll my eyes. If you tell me we are going to need to enter a dream realm so we can teleport beyond this passage, I am going to geld you, Erandur. He stills completely, his hands moving lower on instinct. He gulps. Then I will say nothing, my lord. I snort and walk up to the barrier, testing the thing with my finger and finding it was more repelling me than being a solid block of energy. I closed my eyes and focused on the nightmares, both the ones that preceded my entry to the city and the one which tormented me once I slept within. A red-hot searing rage slowly started to bubble from within me, and I summoned blasphemy, my power covering it in a sheen of flowing grey shadows as the tiny spark of my divinity ignited into being. With a loud snarl, I swung out at the barrier, my blade passing it effortlessly and sailing straight at the soul gem which connected it to its source of power, shattering it completely and opening the passage for us. Letting the rage leave me as I breathed out, I summoned my blade back and turned to the rest with a cheerful grin. Sometimes the simple solutions are the best. Erandur looks at me like I've grown a second head, his eyes frantically moving from me to the now open passage and then back to me. The twins just shrugged and started moving, fully expecting my levels of bullshit at this point. Soon, we stepped out onto the final level, a simple staircase leading up to the pedestal holding the skull of corruption. But of course the world's dramatics would not let me just banish the damned thing and be done with it, because a duo of cultists had survived with their minds intact and stepped out into the opening the moment we descended. Like a pair of complete retards. Scorch provides his most apt tactical analysis. Varen, Thorek. I hear Erandur croak, "You are alive." Varen, another Dunmer, immediately glares at him. "No thanks to you, Casimir." He practically spits the name out. The priest looks like he is just about to falter, but swiftly centers himself, totally having nothing to do with a bit of illusion from yours truly, and firmly states, "I have left that name behind long ago. Now I am Erandur, priest of Mara." A coward and a traitor. The apparent leader of the cult curses, how unsurprising. As Erandur attempts to reflexively explain himself, I clear my throat, catching everyone's attention. "Am I to believe you are the only remaining cultists within this lighthouse?" "This is no mere lighthouse, fool," Varen sneers. "It is a holy temple." He doesn't get to finish his sentence as his head rolls on the floor, his friend following soon after as he attempts to grab his mace. Not letting the Maran contemplate the death of his old friends, I tug his arm and order, "Come, let us be done with this." As I take just another step toward the skull, the old staff bursts with power, slamming into my mind and outright knocking out the rest of my companions. I grit my teeth and took another step, words of temptation slowly making their way to my ears but going completely ignored as I prepared my blade once again, only to suddenly stop as a figure emerged from the floor just below the pedestal upon which the staff floated. A rather familiar figure at that. A perfect copy of myself stood below the altar, the same robes, the same blade, the same irritating cocky grin on his face. It was disgusting. Without a word, I launched myself at him, only to be dodged with a simple shadow step. I threw out a firebolt of gold, only to have it flicked to the side by a perfectly cast ward. I summoned shades only to have them countered with their exact same copies. Well, this was going to be annoying. The copy of myself snickered at my attempts and threw itself at me, engaging me in an elaborate dance as our battle went from mere combat to a clash of the minds with precognition working at full force on both sides. It even used a fire breath I was forced to counter, lest it burn the twins and Erandur to a crisp. The more we fought, the less I appreciated what was going on. For all of the perfection of the copy, it was only that in the end its swings held no passion, its expressions were without soul, and worst of all, its magic was without the endless spark of ambition that fueled my rise. It was infuriating. A stray thought entered my mind as our clash continued. The Daedra may be able to copy my skills, but was it able to copy my artifacts? the same items forged by literal gods. A wide grin spread on my face as the realization sunk in, and I spread my arms welcomingly, allowing the filthy copy to stab its lesser blasphemy through my arm, and not turn it to shreds. With what was by now a fully manic grin, I grabbed the disgusting thing and started to choke it to death. My spark of divinity ensuring its existence was snuffed out before it could do anything. I threw the now lifeless body onto the ground, and it dissolved into shadows. My blood was boiling, the precipice it had stood at ever since I fought Alduin, coming ever so closer as the battle went on, until finally it burst free, enveloping me wholly in an aura of grey light. Immediately the aura of Vermina was pushed back by my presence, and I wasted no time. I brandished blasphemy and launched myself at the skull of corruption, slamming the blade straight into the gnarled tip of the staff. It seemed to resist briefly, the ancient artifact's power coiling to protect it from destruction, but my will was greater than that a false deity's toy, and I pressed forward with a snarl of rage and defiance. The staff's power buckled inward and then shattered, detonating the object into numerous shards of wood and launching the shrapnel all over the place, surprisingly not hitting any of us at all. The power of the Daedra washed over me, attempting to pass me as it realized it would find no purchase. It lashed out toward Boar, but before it could go any further, I found myself grabbing it within my hand, somehow grasping the ephemeral energy, and realizing I could not hold it indefinitely, I threw it upwards, blasting it into the skies and away from this world forevermore. Chapter 299, Chapter 35, Dawnstar Finale. Fury of Dagoth awakened. Your power over the concept of blasphemy grows, its direction drawn toward the denial of greater being you consider evil, false, or wrong. You may now invoke your powers at will and now hold the potential to permanently harm such beings. I do not know how long I stood there, staring at where the staff once stood, but by the time I came back to my senses, the bonfire that was my soul slowly retreated into the mere flicker of a candle, and my fellow temple raiders were slowly awakening. The old priest barely stopped himself from falling over. As he helped the twins up, he slowly turned to me and croaked, "What happened?" "The staff is gone, permanently," I add quickly. He gives me a long, searching look. "How?" I shrug. "You aren't the only one with secrets, priest. Simply accept that Dawnstar will be cursed with nightmares no longer, and leave it at that." Both him and Boar gave me suspicious looks at this, but after some thought they realized they had nothing else to say, and we started to slowly ascend the stairwell, leaving the temple behind us. I stop the old priest from falling over with some light telekinesis, and feel a momentary metaphysical glare aimed straight at the two of us. It disappears almost immediately as I feel Mephalah's glee as she uses the distraction to do as much damage to our foe as possible, no doubt ruining a whole bunch of Vermina's influences as she did so. It was rather difficult to describe the metaphysical sight of two Daedra going at. My vocabulary lacked the exact words to give justice to the glaringly unnatural storm of chaos happening in a realm already known for its lack of common sense. Still, I did not have the opportunity to observe for too long, as the conflict ended as swiftly as it could. Mephalah wasn't one to draw attention from the others after all. Once she understood that I had a rather eager backer, Vermina accepted her loss and fucked off back into the quagmire. An oath of not bothering either of us for at least a century, the price for the end of Mephalah's attack. Satisfied with the outcome, I grabbed the haggard priest and started gently dragging him back up the way we came. He did not seem to mind, as he was barely conscious after all that happened, and whatever Vermina had shown him when she knocked him out seemed to wear him out far more than it did the twins. The twins snapped out of their own stupor as I passed them by and swiftly fell in behind me. "You two doing all right?" I ask lightly as we ascend the stairs. That last push was pretty dangerous, no matter how little managed to get through. Both failed to hold back a sudden shudder at the mention, with Brienne being the one to answer, "No college lesson would have ever prepared me for that." For a moment I felt as if the world itself would bow to me if only I woke up and stopped anyone from destroying the staff. Disgusting is what it was. Boar half shouts and half growls. It felt as if I would forget who I even was for a moment, and all that with a mere touch of the mind. Not all that dissimilar from my own first time. I inform them with a lazy shrug, except the thing trying to mindfuck me back then just wanted me to become a filthy cannibal instead of whatever it is that vermin and cultists do. Ugh, Brienne winces with disgust. They either wish to escape reality or use terror to take control over others. Erendur decides to answer my unasked question after he manages to gather himself somewhat. Most of them just want to forget their woes and accept the Daedra's influence as the price, but there are always some who join the cults for the power it provides. Bor shakes his head and curses, honorless fools. Oh, don't get your robes in a twist. I roll my eyes. People join non-Daedric organizations for power all the damn time. At least the Daedra are somewhat honest with what they offer, even if they usually twist it against you by the end of it. But it doesn't cost them their damned souls, he retorts, evidently irritated by the fact people can be so stupid. Fucker would have failed after 5 seconds if we didn't shield his weak ass. Scorch grouses internally. Neither of us actually liked Bor, but his sister was nice enough, so we tolerated his occasional pig-headedness. Which is why only the thoroughly paranoid should ever deal with Daedra. I smile at him with false cheer. Only through downright unhealthy levels of caution can you avoid the amount of fuckery they keep throwing about. I tilt my head as if suddenly remembering something, or you just become so powerful you can shatter a good chunk of their worldly influence. That also works. The twins' looks turned to ones of fear for a brief moment before the both of them wisely decided not to ask any further questions. Even if they were in solitude when it happened, they weren't completely aware of just how far my little scuffle with Meridia, and now this one went. Their world view could only take so much punishment after all. I let the mildly amused priest walk by himself as he gathers himself enough to do so. The older Dunmer looks around the mostly dilapidated temple with a mix of sadness and regret, but also as if a weight that was pressing on his shoulders for decades was finally lifted. He looks to me and asks, "What do you wish to do with this place, my lord?" I have no real use for it. I wave him off. Rebuild it as a temple of Mara, remake it to house the homeless. Hell, you can even turn it into an emergency storage area. I list off with some exasperation. But for the sake of all you find holy, do not just leave it to rot. It is part of the city's only lighthouse, and having it crumble due to a lack of maintenance would be quite insulting after all that. Erendur chuckles and nods his head. I will make sure the Jarl hears of your suggestions. The people could use a house of the gods after their recent nightmares. He attempts to hide the slightly judgmental look he suddenly directs at me, but fails miserably, from both within and without. His words fail to move me even slightly. The man was a priest of Mara, and violence was just not one of his faith's virtues, even if the lands he called home made it necessary, so he was free to keep his judgment, and I was more than free to simply ignore it. Our conversation turned progressively lighter as we ascended further up, and by the time we left the once gloomy temple, we were already joking and laughing, the men the Jarl subtly sent to report on our progress, giving us some very odd looks as we passed them by. Jarl Brina was one step short of ecstatic when the news reached her, starting out her career as Jarl, only to have the nightmares plaguing your people disappear, but one day after her inauguration would buy her ridiculous amounts of goodwill from the populace, even those idiots who still supported Ulfric for whatever reason. Such was her satisfaction that she was more than happy to allow Erendur to establish a temple under the lighthouse. She would come to regret it later, after she realized just how useful that place could have been, but giving it out to a temple was at least a good PR move, so she shouldn't grumble too much. Tullius was much more subdued in his reaction, simply nodding at the expected outcome and asking me what I planned on doing. Now that I was a bit more free to move around, I gave him a vague answer and then not so subtly redirected the conversation toward another matter, which is how I ended up with a frowning general giving me a half-hearted glare. I still feel that it is too risky. He can obtain political capital in other ways, ones involving much less risk to both his life and cause. He reiterates the same argument we have been having for days. And I am telling you that it needs to be done. I repeat myself with a slight eye roll. He is a Nord, and if he doesn't fight his own battles, then our victory would be forever soured in the eyes of the people. I understand that much. I haven't wasted my time since coming to this frozen land, Tullius allows cautiously, but doing the deed himself. Would Ulfric not use the situation to deliver one final strike before he is sent to his ancestors? I look around the room briefly before gracing the good general with a sly smirk. He only needs to look like he is the one to do it, Tullius. All we need to do is ensure the rightful High King looks good to the masses, especially those in Windhelm. What we actually end up doing is of no consequence as long as word doesn't spread. It takes him but a split second to catch on to what I was saying, and he immediately relaxes after understanding my plan. Very well, I will send a summons to King Torrig to join the army as we march on Windhelm. Once you have dealt with whatever it is you need to do on that mountain, be sure to join us. He holds back a wince at his next words. Assaulting the city without your people's aid would be very costly. I wouldn't miss, if for the end of the world, General. I smirk and spend the next few minutes writing down a letter of sufficient pomp for royalty to be sent to the Blue Palace with the first prisoner ship. I made sure to go over the remaining war plans after that, and soon found myself with a bit of free time as my invitation to the Flamehearts wasn't due until evening, and so my wandering legs took me to one of the other places of interest in Dawnstar. The doors of the chilly museum creaked as I entered the seemingly abandoned home, only to find that there was nothing seeming about it. The place was completely empty, save for a few broken shelves, with not a trace of the mythic Dawn paraphernalia I expected to find. As for the supposed proprietor, he was also nowhere to be found. Some asking around with his neighbors soon told me all I needed to know about what happened. "Oh, it was terrible, Flametongue," the middle-aged Nord woman exclaims. "They all rushed poor Silas only 3 days after he set up his museum, torn him to pieces they did, and the guards did nothing about it, the bastards." So yeah, Silas Vezius, the imbecile who thought setting up a museum about the mythic Dawn in a city that practically worshipped the Septim dynasty was a good idea, ended up being lynched and his body tossed into someone's pig pen. Naming yourself as the descendant of the same people who killed the literal sacred bloodline of the Empire and then gathering their stuff and displaying it in silent praise. I genuinely don't know how the fool expected it to end in any other way. Still, quite a shame I wouldn't be able to examine that instant kill enchantment. As I turn to leave, a slightly out-of-place board on the floor draws my attention, my eyes immediately turning from first person to all the persons at once, only to find a small booklet sitting snugly between the boards and foundations. With a lazy wave of my hand, the booklet flew out from its hiding place, and after flicking through it, I realized that it was indeed the idiot's diary. It talked about his terminally retarded ambition of celebrating his ancestors and slowly turned to his budding worship of Mehrunes Dagon, the Daedra guilty of invading Tamriel 2 centuries ago. Yeah, absolutely no pity for this one. Scorch shakes his head. My excitement slowly died out as I went over his inane thoughts, only to return full force once I flipped the final page and found it to contain a small list instead. 3 places housing 3 pieces of Mehrunes' razor, the blade which could supposedly kill anything with a single strike. Odd that all of them are in the hands of different Orsimer camps. I muse idly before shrugging and ripping out the final page and tossing the rest to the dusty floor. Whatever, it should make a fun little quest for Davos while I go and irritate the greybeards. And so, as if I didn't just callously toss the last memories of a man to rot in the open air, I left for the central part of the city, the terminal idiot already long since forgotten. The supposed feast at the Flameheart's place was the opposite of the usual joviality one might expect from the rowdy Nords. The vast majority of the clan were silent Stormcloak supporters, and my presence was viewed like something akin to an unforgivable insult. It was just too bad they could not back up their shitty opinions with anything even vaguely resembling sufficient force, and thus they were forced to deal with my sickly sweet politeness for the entire night. The younger kids naturally didn't give a single shit about the mounting tensions and kept asking me blissfully ignorant questions, which I then shamelessly used to dig into the whole clan as deeply as I could. By the time Balor announced his abdication to his son, the whole 36 clansmen looked like their souls had been sucked out of them. So much so that they merely nodded at the sudden change in leadership and accepted it for what it was. namely punishment for their silent betrayal and effective puppeting of their family for many years to come. I did get to meet the twins' mother, a terribly sweet woman who was no doubt the source of Brienne's usual sunny disposition. She was bedridden for ages, with no one from the clan being able to heal her, even with their supposedly vaunted skills at the art. The twins' looks, as I healed her with a simple spell and potion combo, were worthy of forever being burned into my mind, even if their father glared at me for pissing on his pride once again. Honestly, if it wouldn't have cost the poor woman whatever little happiness she would have been managed to attain after being healed, I would have probably snapped his head off his shoulders for that alone. Imagine being such a cuck you do not allow your wife to get healing just so you can keep your clan's pride. Who even does that? Someone cursed with small pp, obviously, Scorch proposed without hesitation. Wouldn't surprise me. I held back a snort as I looked at the reddening man and left their longhouse not long after. That night I slept like a log, neither natural nor unnatural nightmares plaguing my respite. Chapter 300. Chapter Taissav. Of Greed and Dungeons. The walls and towers of Dawnstar became but distant spots on the horizon as Scorch carried me south, the two of us having left as soon as we were able. I still had to ensure my troops knew to return to Silrune Fell to prepare for the next phase in our expansion and that Tullius would not have any problems in the near future. It wouldn't do to have our army slowed by pig-headed malcontents still stubbornly holding on to Ulfric's shattered cause, and I was nice enough to only steal their weapons for the crimes they planned on committing. Even then, the army would only march after order was restored and reinforcements arrived to bolster the upcoming siege. Even with our rather disgusting casualty ratio, we still lost many thousands of soldiers, and Windhelm would be a much tougher nut to crack than Dawnstar. Even with our prepared strategy, I just hoped the dragons would be nice enough to wait a bit until they continued with their rampages, wouldn't want to give anyone an excuse for a gracious truce. In fact, I flicked a large scroll into my hand, holding it straight with a light application of telekinesis, and started writing down a massive order of some extra lower-tier ballistae to be delivered in secret to every single loyal hold, meaning all but one, in preparation. The scroll soon disappeared, and I had Scorch speed up, almost feeling a hidden weight fall off my shoulders as Dawnstar's hold was left behind. Now then, I do wonder what the others were up to. General POV. How is it that everyone already knows who we are already? We came here as fast as we reasonably could. Minthara complains as her and a duo of her companions leave the Vilemere Inn, the central tavern of the town of Ivarstead. Marco snorts and shakes his head. I wouldn't be surprised if Black Marsh already knew. The Dragonborn closes her eyes and takes a deep breath, the raging flames of her irritation with her newfound reputation slowly smouldering back to a more controllable level. She slowly breathes out and curses fucking gossips. Marco snickers at her suffering. Just imagine how bad it will get when those Winterhold orbs become commonplace for all mages. She suddenly stills and looks at him with despair in her eyes. We must destroy them. Sorry to say, but they aren't even that expensive to build, apparently. The bard shrugs with a glint in his eye, and at least 4 people know how to build them already, including our dearest teacher. They die, she declares with conviction, only to get shoved forward slightly by an amused housecarl. Come now, my Thane. Lydia fails to hold back a chuckle. It can't be that bad. Minthara's eyes narrow into slits as she gives her a glare. It disappears as swiftly as it came, but it was more than enough to remind the target of her rage of what happened last time. Flashback. Hey Lydia, Minthara calls out, her housecarl walking up to the stall as she looked at the pile of preserved food sheepishly. I seem to have bought a bit more than I can carry. Can you help me out? Lydia held back a sigh and nodded. Of course, my Thane. I am sworn to carry your burdens. Her voice was almost without sarcasm. The glint in Minthara's eyes as she said those words made the young housecarl feel all kinds of in danger. Days later. A sea of corpses, both human and horse, greeted the group as they passed the Valtheim towers, most of whom bore some kind of stormcloak livery, and all of whom were pierced with familiar crossbow and ballista bolts. Marco and Lydia reacted as one might expect when seeing such a thing, both of them showing revulsion at what they saw. Delphine being the only blade in the group, as Esbern decided to remain behind and study the dragon attacks with Farengar, and Junior showed no outside reaction to the scene, but were internally analyzing every single clue they could catch. Minthara's eyes, on the other hand, shone with greed. She wasted no time and immediately started searching the scene of the massacre for any valuable loot, and before long she had a nice pile of rune-scripted swords and axes neatly tied into a bundle, even as semi-dried blood and other fluids still dripped from them. Hearing a disgusted scoff and feeling a disappointed glare being directed at her back, the Dragonborn turned around far too quickly for anyone to react, and just in time to see Lydia trying to control her expression of disgust. A sunny smile spread on the demi-goddess's face as she picked the bundle up and proffered it to the disgruntled housecarl. "Would you be so kind as to carry this for me, Lydia? My packs are full already." Lydia shifted uncomfortably. "My Thane, that is—" Many words she wanted to say, but none would come out as the obviously fake smile of her lady chilled her to the bone. Uncaring for the housecarl's predicament, Minthara came near her and whispered coldly, "You were sworn to carry my burdens, were you not?" The housecarl wisely decided to quit while she could, and simply accepted her fate and picked the bundle up, knowing damn well her armor would be filthy by the end of the day. She had to carry it for 3. Back to the present. Her follower appropriately cowed, Minthara led the way outside the thin palisades of Ivarstead and toward a small camp her group had set up when they arrived. Riften had supposedly switched sides a day ago, but Junior advised her to not draw too much attention as they did not know that neat little fact before they spoke to the innkeeper. Their campsite was well hidden, positioned in a small depression in the forest floor and surrounded by a thick wall of tall trees. Someone would have to literally stumble their way into it to find it, and somehow Delphine still judged it to be too open. They were quickly noticed by Junior and thus avoided getting reflexively stabbed by the paranoid blade. They shared the news with the 2 agents and soon came upon the topic of the fancy sapphire claw hanging off of Minthara's belt. "Why do you have that?" Delphine asked suspiciously before quickly adding, "My lady." She was still not terribly respected by her charge and had to repeatedly hold herself back from offering any kind of criticism. Minthara frowned momentarily but still explained, "The innkeeper asked us to find out what is happening in the Shroud Hearth Barrow near the town. Apparently the people are growing paranoid about it being haunted." She holds back a scowl. "The fool is lucky I am actually trustworthy enough to do what he asked, instead of just running off with the claw. There are tales of undead armies being broken and of dragons returning, and the locals are afraid of a little haunting," Junior asked, genuinely astonished, and not in a good way. "Oh, I wouldn't count on them to worry about anything beyond their walls." Marco spoke up, his tone that of amusement. They would worry about a wolf stealing their chickens before they even bothered with mentions of dragons. He gave Minthara a quick glance at that. They would need to land on their homes for them to care. "Great," the Imperial agent deadpanned. Delphine nodded her agreement. "That much is known, but why are we wasting time with this to begin with?" "We are waiting for Raven." Minthara's response was clipped. "If I have to deal with a bunch of cryptic old men who haven't left their cave for decades, then I am bringing someone who can infuriate them as much as they will probably infuriate myself." She earned multiple odd looks for that, but she was long past caring about that and simply picked her blade up and started walking, uncaring if anyone would follow her. The ethereal body flickered back into its physical form as a spectral blade slashed its head off, revealing a rugged-looking Dunmer well into his 200s. "A potion effect," Junior declared immediately. "So much for haunting," Marco quipped, even as he wiped a small bead of swat from his brow when he thought no one was looking. Delphine connected the clues just as quickly. He must have been relying on the Nord's superstitions while he looted the whole place as best as he could. She pointed toward a dustless leather sack in one of the corners of the room. "That is probably all the plunder he managed to gather." The greedy half-dragon was already halfway through the pile by the time she finished her sentence. The group waited for Junior to go through the tomb robber's journal, pretty much confirming their earlier assumptions, and then all of them descended deeper into the barrow. Just because he was stupid enough to be noticed by the locals doesn't mean Minthara wouldn't use the opportunity to enrich herself. She knew deep down that she would never have to worry about money again, but the memories of her little trip to Cyrodiil were still fresh, and she could always just send the money from the loot to Solitude. The far too lich-looking dragon priest's spine shattered completely under the surprised dragonborn's unarmed strike. The creature was not even able to rise from its coffin, as it was immediately beset by a flurry of armored fists and lightning bolts. The two adventurers, having such hatred for the undead creatures, they did not even hesitate to consider the danger and simply unloaded on the poor thing. The rest pointedly did not comment on the reaction and also ignored Minthara's twitchy hands as she declared the place safe for pillaging. 3 days later, the group found themselves in front of a cave carved into the side of a small hill. The entrance echoed with the sound of running water and smelled too fresh for what they knew it to be. "Are we sure we don't want to wait?" Marco asked tentatively. Lydia also looked hesitant, their previous descent into a dungeon having thoroughly informed her of just how numerous the defenders usually were. "We are not weaklings anymore," Minthara declared. "If there is a threat to us in there, then we will all die to the dragons anyway." "And this has nothing to do with you being bored?" the Ultima asked wryly. Her eyes narrowed and a small smirk emerged on her face. "Maybe if you could sing better, we wouldn't be bored enough to prefer fighting the walking dead." He winced and clutched at his heart. Oof. This prompted a few light chuckles, but that did not last as the group soon turned serious and entered the supposed tomb of Archmage Gaimund. Raven's POV. My connection to Marco's loot quickly led me toward the group's general location. I frowned as I realized they had already entered the tomb, but I did not worry overmuch. Any loss of theirs would have to be a fuck-up of galactic proportions in this situation. And so I found myself walking through the ruined halls at a leisurely pace. Many of the underground water flows on the way having been bridged seemingly by alteration magic, and even a brand new stairwell led down into the depths, where any invaders would once have had to take a leap of faith to enter. I passed almost the entire burial site before I started hearing the sounds of battle, mostly demands for someone to stop running and warnings of not overextending. A grin unwillingly spread on my face as I walked in on the scene of a spectral Draugr leading Minthara and her group on a merry chase as he teleported from one platform to another. A small web-like network of mark and recall runes connecting the massive chamber and all of the 20 pillars within, allowing him to do so for almost no cost. The frustrated demigoddess even tried stopping time, but the mad lad once known as Sigdis Guldursson had just enough time to replace himself with a mere illusion. This continued for a good 5 minutes. They tried everything. Delphine and Junior attempted to position themselves to ambush him. Marco attempted mowing the illusions down, and Minthara even tried just overwhelming the entire room with wind blades. This all failed. The final son of Guldur kept teleporting just out of range and resummoning his illusions while constantly peppering the group with his spectral arrows, luckily not achieving much of anything either. They would have probably ended him after a while as teleportation was draining no matter what you did to prepare, and his illusions did not help. But after a while I grew bored with the merry chase and simply targeted all of the runes at once, blasting them with a forking lightning spell and shattering them all in an instant. The spectral Draugr was caught completely off guard when his little network disappeared right from under him, his surprise overcoming his undead battle drive just long enough to have a pommel smashed into his head with the force of a giant, promptly turning said head into mush and launching it away like so much shrapnel. Seemingly realizing that there was something off, Minthara slowly turned to where the spell came from, and the moment she saw me, her expression immediately shifted to that of a deer caught in headlights. I think she would have preferred chasing the teleporter to this.